You don't belong here. 4 words, spoken with venom, meant to destroy. Lydia Crow's voice cut through the glittering ballroom like a blade, her diamond-draped finger pointing at a trembling server whose only crime was existing in her sight. The room held its breath. Staff froze mid-step. Guests pretended not to notice. This was how power worked in Ethan Hale's world, swift, silent, absolute. One woman decided who stayed, who left, who ate, who starved. And no one ever dared to challenge her. No one had survived it, until tonight, until a quiet voice said 2 words that changed everything. That's enough. The crystal chandeliers seemed to dim. 200 people turned as one, and for the first time in 5 years, Lydia Crow's cruelty met something it had never encountered before. Resistance. If you want to see how one moment of courage can shatter an empire built on fear, stay with me until the very end. And please, comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story of truth and justice travels across the world. The Blackstone Grand Hotel didn't just host events. It swallowed them whole, transformed them into legend, and spit out reputations either made or ruined. Tonight was no different. The annual Hale Foundation Gala drew the kind of crowd that didn't need to prove their wealth. Their presence was proof enough. Senators mingled with tech moguls. Philanthropists air-kissed fashion designers. And at the center of it all, like a spider in a web of crystal and champagne, stood Lydia Crow. She wore white, always white. A floor-length gown that cost more than most people's annual salary, cut to perfection, designed to broadcast one message: untouchable. Her blonde hair fell in calculated waves over one bare shoulder. Her smile was practiced, perfect, and entirely empty. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had never been told no and never expected to hear it. Beside her, though never quite with her, walked Ethan Hale. At 34, Ethan carried the kind of presence that couldn't be bought. The straight spine of old money, the sharp eyes of new ambition, and the quiet heaviness of someone who had inherited more than wealth. He had inherited expectations. His grandfather had built Hale Industries from steel and sweat. His father had expanded it into tech and real estate. And Ethan? Ethan was expected to make it immortal. He looked the part. Tailored black tuxedo, dark hair swept back, a jawline that magazines loved and boardrooms respected. But tonight, something flickered behind his carefully controlled expression. Something that looked almost like exhaustion. Ethan, darling, Senator Whitmore wants a word about the education initiative. Lydia's voice was honey-laced with commands. She didn't ask, she informed. Of course. Ethan's response was automatic. Smooth, empty. They moved through the ballroom like a coronation procession. Guests parted naturally. Staff became invisible. This was the routine they'd perfected over 5 years of engagement. Lydia orchestrated, Ethan executed, and the world applauded. But in the shadows between champagne towers and flower arrangements worth thousands, another world existed entirely. Mara Quinn stood near the service entrance, her dark eyes taking in everything while appearing to notice nothing. At 28, she had mastered the art of functional invisibility, the kind that allowed her to move through spaces like these without drawing attention, without triggering the casual cruelty that powerful people deployed against those they considered beneath notice. She'd been working at the Blackstone for exactly 4 days. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, her face professionally blank. But behind that carefully constructed mask, Mara's mind worked like a precision instrument, cataloging, analyzing, understanding. She'd grown up in places where survival meant reading rooms faster than most people read books. Foster homes taught you to spot danger before it spotted you. Group homes taught you that authority wasn't always right, just powerful. And 3 years working her way through community college while holding down 2 jobs taught her that the difference between justice and cruelty often came down to who held the microphone. Tonight, she was supposed to be invisible. Refill glasses, clear plates, fade into the expensive wallpaper. Instead, she was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. I specifically said no ice. Lydia's voice carried across the ballroom with the precision of a thrown knife. Are you incapable of following simple instructions? The target was Marcus Chen, a waiter who'd been with the Blackstone for 6 years. 43 years old, father of two, working double shifts to cover his daughter's medical bills. Mara knew this because she'd made it her business to know the people she worked beside, their names, their stories, their struggles. Marcus's hands trembled as he held the offending glass of water. "I'm so sorry, Miss Crow. I'll get you another immediately." "You'll get yourself fired, is what you'll do." Lydia plucked the glass from his hands with 2 fingers, as if touching it longer might contaminate her. How many chances does incompetence deserve? The ballroom's ambient noise, the string quartet, the polite laughter, the clinking crystal, seemed to lower by degrees. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted. People were listening now, watching from the corners of their eyes while pretending fascination with their own discussions. This was entertainment for them, a floor show. Marcus's face had gone pale. "Please, Miss Crow, I have a family. My daughter needs—" "Your family isn't my concern." Lydia's smile was surgical. "Your employment is entirely at my discretion." "Ethan?" She turned to her fiancé with the casual confidence of someone calling in a favor that wasn't really a favor at all. It was a command wrapped in affection, a test disguised as trust. Ethan stood 3 feet away, champagne glass in hand, having a surface-level conversation with a tech investor. But Mara saw his shoulders tense, saw the micro-expression that crossed his face before the mask slammed back down, something that looked uncomfortably like shame. "Lydia, it's just ice," he started. "It's principle." Her voice stayed sweet, but her eyes went cold. "Standards matter, darling. You taught me that." It was masterful manipulation. She'd taken his own words, his own values, and weaponized them, made her cruelty his responsibility, forced him to either endorse her behavior or publicly contradict his fiancée in front of 200 witnesses. Ethan's jaw tightened. For 3 seconds, Mara counted them. He seemed to wage some internal war. Then his expression smoothed into practiced neutrality. "Marcus, please be more careful. We expect excellence here." It wasn't quite agreement. But it wasn't defense either. It was the diplomatic nothing of someone who'd learned to navigate without taking sides, to survive without making waves. Marcus's shoulders sagged. "Yes, Mr. Hale. My apologies." He turned to leave, defeat written in every line of his body. Around them, conversations resumed. The moment was passing. Another small cruelty, absorbed and forgotten. Except Mara wasn't forgetting. She'd seen this pattern before. Different settings, different players, same script. Power flexing itself just because it could. Dignity crushed for entertainment. And everyone looking away because it was easier, safer, smarter to pretend they hadn't seen anything at all. Her supervisor, Gerald, caught her eye from across the room. His expression was clear. "Don't even think about it. Stay invisible. Do your job." Mara had spent most of her life being smart, being careful, knowing when to speak and when silence meant survival. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, there came a moment when silence became complicity, when looking away became participation, when the cost of speaking up seemed impossibly high, right until you calculated the cost of staying quiet. She was 4 days into this job, 4 days away from eviction if she lost it, 4 days into finally getting stable employment after months of apartment hunting and resume sending and interview bombing. Every logical part of her brain screamed the same message: don't do it. Mara stepped forward. The movement was quiet. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice. She simply walked into the space Marcus had just vacated, positioning herself at a respectful but unmissable distance from Lydia Crow. "Excuse me, Miss Crow." Her voice was steady. Not confrontational, not weak, just present. The ballroom's ambient noise seemed to drop another octave. Heads turned with the smooth synchronization of predators spotting movement. Lydia's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, the only crack in her expression. "I'm sorry?" Lydia's tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all, merely surprised that furniture had learned to speak. "I couldn't help but overhear," Mara continued, maintaining eye contact in a way that was respectful but not submissive. "Marcus is one of our most dedicated staff members. He's been working extra shifts to cover his daughter's hospital bills. I think perhaps the ice was simply an oversight in what's been an incredibly demanding evening." For exactly 2 seconds, nobody moved. Then Lydia laughed. It was a bright crystalline sound, the kind that appeared delighted but landed like broken glass. How fascinating. She tilted her head, studying Mara with the clinical interest of someone examining an unusual insect. And you are? Mara Quinn, ma'am. I started this week in hospitality services. This week. Lydia's smile sharpened. How wonderfully brave of you to offer commentary on situations you couldn't possibly understand after 4 whole days of employment. Around them, the invisible audience leaned in. Phones stayed in pockets. Recording would be crass. But this moment would be discussed, dissected, and distributed through whispered conversations before dessert was served. Mara felt the weight of every eye in the room, felt Gerald's panic radiating from across the ballroom, felt her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. But she also felt something else, something that had kept her alive through group homes and hunger, through nights sleeping in her car, and days smiling through retail customers who treated her like dirt. A core of absolute certainty about what was right and what was wrong, regardless of who had the power to enforce which. I understand that everyone here, regardless of their position, deserves to be treated with basic dignity, Mara said quietly. And I understand that mistakes happen, especially to good people under pressure. The ballroom went completely silent. Even the string quartet seemed to sense the shift and allowed their current piece to trail into nothing. Lydia's smile vanished like someone had flipped a switch. You understand nothing. Her voice stayed low, but venom dripped from every syllable. You're a 4-day employee with delusions of relevance, speaking about matters that don't concern you to people who don't acknowledge your existence. She stepped closer. Mara held her ground. Let me educate you about how the world actually works, since you clearly need the lesson. Lydia's eyes glittered with something that looked almost eager. She was enjoying this now, warming to the performance. People like you? You're interchangeable, replaceable. You exist to serve, not to have opinions. And when you forget that distinction, you stop existing here at all. Lydia. Ethan's voice cut through the tension. He'd moved closer, though Mara couldn't tell if it was to intervene or simply to contain the spectacle. That's unnecessary. Is it? Lydia turned to him, and Mara caught the calculation in that movement. This wasn't anger, it was strategy. Your staff is openly contradicting guests at our event, darling. I would think you'd want to address that. The trap was elegant. Make it about Ethan's authority, his reputation, his ability to control his own house. Force him to choose between his fiancée and a nobody employee he'd probably never spoken to before tonight. Mara watched Ethan's face, watched him calculate the costs and consequences of every possible response. Watched the muscles in his jaw work as he ground through options that all seemed to lead somewhere uncomfortable. And for just a moment, so brief she might have imagined it, she saw something in his eyes that looked like recognition, like he knew exactly what was happening and hated it, but couldn't figure out how to stop it without making everything worse. I think perhaps, Ethan started, but he never got to finish that thought. Because that's when Marcus Chen collapsed. Not dramatically, not loudly. He simply crumpled where he stood, champagne tray clattering to the marble floor, his body folding in on itself as if all the strength had been suddenly cut from his strings. The ballroom erupted. Women gasped. Men surged forward. The invisible barrier that had separated staff from guests dissolved in an instant as a dozen people rushed toward the fallen waiter. Someone call 911! Give him space! Is there a doctor? Mara was already moving, dropping to her knees beside Marcus before her brain fully registered the decision. She'd taken emergency response training years ago, a requirement for one of her many previous jobs, and the protocols came back like muscle memory. Marcus? Marcus, can you hear me? She checked his pulse, rapid and weak. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow. Someone get me some water, and yes, call 911 immediately. A doctor emerged from the crowd, there was always a doctor at these events, and took over with professional efficiency. But not before Mara heard Marcus whisper something, his voice barely audible. My daughter. I can't lose this job. Please. Then his eyes rolled back and he was unconscious. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later. They loaded Marcus onto a stretcher with practiced speed while the ballroom full of Manhattan's elite watched in uncomfortable silence. Entertainment had crossed into emergency, and nobody quite knew what to do with that. except Lydia. Well, her voice cut through the subdued murmuring like she was resuming a conversation briefly interrupted. I suppose that's what happens when people work beyond their capabilities. The cruelty of it hit like a physical blow. Mara felt rage, pure and clarifying, flood through her system. She stood slowly, turned to face Lydia Crow, and this time she didn't bother with respectful distance or careful tone. That man just collapsed from exhaustion and stress. Stress partly caused by being publicly humiliated while working double shifts to keep his daughter alive. And your response is to blame him for not being strong enough to handle your cruelty? Gasps rippled through the crowd. Gerald looked like he might actually faint. Even the doctor pausing with the stretcher turned to stare. Lydia's face transformed. The mask of sophisticated cruelty cracked, revealing something uglier underneath. Genuine rage, uncut and undiluted. How dare you? She stepped forward, and for the first time that evening looked truly unhinged. How dare you speak to me that way? Do you have any idea who I am? What I could do to you? I know exactly what you could do. Mara's voice stayed steady, even as her hands trembled. You could have me fired. You could make sure I never work in this city again. You have that power. She paused, held Lydia's furious gaze. But having power doesn't make you right. It just makes you powerful. The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Charged, inevitable, about to explode. Lydia raised her hand. Not to gesture, to strike. Time seemed to slow. Mara saw the arc of that diamond-heavy hand moving toward her face, saw the calculated fury in Lydia's eyes. This wasn't impulse, it was punishment. Saw the crowd frozen between shock and anticipation, saw Ethan lunge forward. His hand caught Lydia's wrist an inch from Mara's cheek. The crack of palm on palm echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. That's enough. Ethan's voice was quiet, but something in it made the entire room take a collective step back. This wasn't polite Ethan, diplomatic Ethan, carefully controlled public figure Ethan. This was something colder, harder, more real. Lydia stared at him, genuine shock replacing calculated rage. In 5 years of engagement, he had never, not once, publicly contradicted her, never stopped her, never chosen anyone else's side over hers. Ethan, she started, I said that's enough. He released her wrist and stepped between her and Mara. The gala is over. Everyone, please enjoy the rest of your evening. My apologies for the disruption. It was a dismissal delivered with such absolute authority that even senators started moving toward exits. The crowd dispersed with the uncomfortable speed of people who'd witnessed something they'd rather not discuss, something that complicated the clean narratives they preferred about wealth and power and who deserved what. Within minutes, the ballroom had emptied of guests. Only staff remained, frozen in various positions, unsure whether to continue cleaning or evacuate. Lydia stood in the center of the marble floor like a statue carved from ice and rage. Ethan faced her with an expression Mara couldn't quite read, and Mara herself stood slightly behind him, heart hammering, brain trying to catch up with what had just happened. Gerald appeared at her elbow, his face pale. Miss Quinn, my office. Now. Gerald, Ethan started. With respect, Mr. Hale, this is a staff matter. Gerald's voice was firm, but his hands shook slightly. He'd been caught between two disasters and was choosing the one he thought he could manage. Miss Quinn violated multiple protocols tonight. That requires immediate discussion. Mara nodded slowly. She'd known this was coming, had known it from the moment she opened her mouth. But knowing something and feeling it are different experiences, and right now she felt the full weight of what speaking up might cost. I understand, she said quietly. She turned to follow Gerald, but Ethan's voice stopped her. Wait. Everyone froze. Lydia's eyes narrowed. Gerald looked like he wanted to argue but didn't dare, and Mara turned back to find Ethan studying her with an expression that seemed to be calculating something, weighing something, deciding something. What's your full name? He asked. Mara Quinn, sir. How long have you been working here, Miss Quinn? 4 days. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his face, gone too quickly to be certain. And in those 4 days, you've managed to do something I don't think I've seen in 5 years. Lydia's posture went rigid. Ethan, what are you? You told the truth. He kept his eyes on Mara, directly, without calculation, without fear of consequences. He paused, and for the first time that evening, Mara saw past the billionaire armor to something that looked almost human, almost tired, almost sad. That's either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, Ethan continued. I haven't decided which. Probably both, Mara admitted. This time the smile definitely appeared, brief but genuine. Then it vanished and the mask slammed back down. Gerald, we'll discuss Miss Quinn's employment tomorrow. For tonight, she's suspended with pay pending investigation. It wasn't quite fired. But it wasn't saved either. It was bureaucratic purgatory, the professional equivalent of limbo. Mara nodded. Thank you, Mr. Hale. She followed Gerald toward the service corridors, feeling the weight of Lydia's fury boring into her back like laser sights. Behind her, she heard Lydia's voice, low and venomous. You made me look like a fool, Ethan. You did that yourself. I am your fiancée. I am the face of your foundation, your events, your public image, and you humiliated me in front of everyone who matters. No, Lydia, you humiliated yourself. I just stopped you from making it worse. Their voices faded as Mara pushed through the service door. Gerald walked 3 steps ahead, his back rigid with fury or fear or both. Do you have any idea what you've done? He hissed once they were alone in the fluorescent-lit corridor. Any idea at all? I stood up for someone who was being treated cruelly, Mara said simply. You committed career suicide. Gerald spun to face her, and she saw genuine distress in his expression. Miss Crow is engaged to Ethan Hale. She has more power in her left hand than you'll accumulate in your entire life, and you just publicly called her cruel in front of Manhattan's elite. She is cruel. That's not the point. Gerald ran a hand over his face. The point is survival, Miss Quinn. The point is keeping your head down and your mouth shut and your opinions to yourself so you can pay your rent and eat food and exist in this world without getting crushed by people who barely notice they're stepping on you. Mara looked at him, really looked, and saw someone who'd been crushed so many times he'd forgotten how to stand up straight. Saw someone who'd learned to survive by becoming invisible, inoffensive, irrelevant. She understood that impulse. God knows she'd lived it most of her life. But tonight, watching Marcus collapse after being humiliated for the crime of a missing ice cube, something in her had broken. Or maybe something had finally healed enough that she could afford to break. I know, she said quietly. I know everything you're saying is right. Strategically, practically. I know I should have kept quiet. Then why didn't you? Mara thought about that question. About foster homes where adults who should have protected her had looked away instead. About teachers who'd seen her potential but had been too tired to fight for it. About every moment in her life when someone with power had chosen convenience over courage. Because somebody had to, she said finally, and everybody else was looking away. Gerald stared at her for a long moment. Then he sighed, deep and weary and resigned. Clear out your locker, Miss Quinn. You'll hear from HR tomorrow about next steps. But between you and me, he lowered his voice. Start looking for a new job, because even if Mr. Hale doesn't fire you, Lydia Crow will make sure you're gone within a week. He walked away, leaving Mara alone in the harsh fluorescent corridor. She should have felt panic, should have felt regret, should have been calculating rent deadlines and job applications and how many days she could stretch her savings. Instead, she felt strangely calm. She'd spent so much of her life being afraid of being seen, afraid of speaking up, afraid of the consequences of existing too loudly in spaces that wanted her silent and small. Tonight, she'd been seen, she'd spoken, and yes, there would be consequences. But for the first time in a long time, Mara Quinn felt like the person she saw in the mirror might actually be someone she could respect. She walked to the employee locker room, retrieved her coat and bag, and headed for the exit. The night air hit her face like a baptism, cold and clarifying and real. Behind her, the Blackstone Grand Hotel glowed like a jewel, hosting the final hours of an event that would be discussed in whispers and speculation for weeks to come. And somewhere in that gleaming building, decisions were being made about her future by people who didn't know her name until an hour ago. But Mara had already made her own decision. She'd chosen to be the kind of person who spoke up, who stood between cruelty and its victims, who refused to look away just because looking was uncomfortable. Whatever came next, unemployment, blacklisting, consequences she couldn't yet imagine, she'd face it knowing she'd done the right thing. Sometimes that had to be enough. The subway station swallowed her into its fluorescent depths. The platform was nearly empty at this hour, just a few late-night workers and one man in a business suit who'd clearly had a long day. Mara leaned against a pillar and finally allowed herself to shake. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "This is Patricia Reeves, Mr. Hale's executive assistant. Please report to the Hale Industries headquarters tomorrow at 10 a.m. Address below. Come to the 47th floor reception." Mara stared at the message. This was it. The official firing, delivered in person, probably to avoid wrongful termination claims, or maybe just to make sure she understood exactly how thoroughly she'd been expelled from their world. She typed back, "I'll be there." The train arrived with a screech of metal and a blast of recycled air. Mara stepped aboard and found a seat by the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of light and shadow. Tomorrow she'd face whatever consequences her courage had bought. Tonight she'd sleep knowing she'd finally become the person she'd always wanted to be. Someone who looked back when everyone else looked away. Someone who spoke up when everyone else stayed silent. Someone who chose right over safe, even when safe was so much smarter. The train carried her into the darkness, toward an uncertain future, toward consequences she couldn't predict or control. But for the first time in years, Mara Quinn wasn't afraid. She was ready. Mara didn't sleep that night. She told herself it was the adrenaline, the way her body kept replaying every moment of the confrontation like a highlight reel she couldn't pause. But deeper down, in the parts of herself she tried not to examine too closely, she knew it was something else. It was the awareness that tomorrow morning she'd walk into the kind of building where decisions got made that could alter the trajectory of entire lives, and she'd be standing on the wrong side of all that power with nothing but her own conviction to shield her. At 9:30, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror practicing what she'd say, practicing dignity, practicing grace under pressure. But every rehearsed sentence sounded either defensive or desperate, and she finally gave up, settling instead for the simple resolution to tell the truth and let the consequences arrange themselves however they would. The Hale Industries Tower occupied an entire block in Midtown Manhattan, all glass and steel and architectural ambition. Mara had walked past it 100 times without really seeing it, just another monument to wealth in a city built from them. But standing in front of it now, knowing she was about to enter as a summoned subject rather than an invisible passerby, the building seemed to grow taller, more imposing, more deliberately designed to make normal people feel small. She pushed through the revolving doors at exactly 9:55. The lobby could have housed a cathedral. Marble floors stretched toward reception desks that looked like they'd been carved from single pieces of stone. Security personnel in sharp suits monitored everyone with the professional paranoia of people paid to see threats everywhere. And above it all, suspended from cables so thin they were nearly invisible, hung a massive bronze sculpture of something abstract and expensive. Mara approached the main desk where a woman with perfect posture and a name tag reading Jennifer looked up with the kind of smile that was trained rather than felt. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "I have an appointment on the 47th floor, Mara Quinn." Jennifer's fingers flew across her keyboard. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or surprise that someone dressed in Mara's off-rack blazer and department store shoes had legitimate business in the executive levels. "Of course, Miss Quinn, you'll need a visitor badge." She produced a lanyard with practiced efficiency. "Take the elevators on your left to the Sky Lobby on 32, then transfer to the executive elevators. Ms. Reeves is expecting you." The elevator ride gave Mara 60 seconds to regret every decision that had led to this moment. The car was empty except for her and her reflection in the polished brass doors. A 28-year-old woman in her best interview suit that still somehow looked like it was trying too hard. Dark hair pulled back in a professional bun that had taken 3 attempts to get right. Exhaustion painted under her eyes, no matter how much concealer she'd applied. She looked exactly like what she was. Someone out of her depth, trying to look like she belonged in depths where she had no business swimming. The 47th floor receptionist was different from the lobby version. Older, sharper, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to calculate your net worth and find it wanting in the time it took you to say hello. But her smile was warmer than Mara expected. "Miss Quinn, please, have a seat. Ms. Reeves will be with you shortly." The waiting area featured leather chairs that probably cost more than Mara's monthly rent and art that looked important even if she couldn't explain why. She sat on the edge of one chair, back straight, hands folded, looking like someone waiting for a verdict, which, she supposed, she was. "Miss Quinn?" Mara looked up to find a woman in her 50s approaching, black, elegant, wearing a dove-gray suit that spoke of quiet authority rather than loud wealth. Patricia Reeves moved with the confidence of someone who'd earned her position through competence rather than connections, and her handshake was firm without being aggressive. "Thank you for coming. Please, follow me." They walked through corridors lined with glass-walled conference rooms and offices where people in expensive clothes made expensive decisions. Mara caught fragments of conversations, mergers, acquisitions, market projections, the language of people for whom millions were units of measurement rather than life-changing sums. Patricia's office was smaller than Mara expected, but somehow more impressive for its restraint, organized without being sterile, personal without being cluttered. The kind of space that suggested its occupant was too busy doing actual work to worry about impressive displays of status. "Please, sit." Patricia gestured to a chair across from her desk. She didn't sit immediately herself, but instead moved to a sidebar where a coffee service waited. "Coffee? Tea?" "Coffee would be great. Thank you." Patricia poured 2 cups with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, handed one to Mara, then finally sat down. For a long moment, she simply studied Mara with an expression that seemed to be measuring something, weighing something, deciding something. "Do you know why you're here, Miss Quinn?" "I assume to be officially terminated." "Interesting." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. "Why would you assume that?" Mara took a careful sip of coffee. It was excellent, which somehow made everything worse, because I publicly contradicted and criticized Lydia Crow at an event she was essentially hosting. Because I embarrassed her in front of 200 witnesses. Because people in my position don't survive speaking truth to people in her position. "People in your position." Patricia repeated the phrase like she was tasting it, testing its validity. "And what position is that exactly?" "Powerless, replaceable, expendable." "Honest." Patricia's correction was gentle but firm. "The position you occupy, Miss Quinn, is honest. And you'd be surprised how rare that position actually is, especially in buildings like this one." She set down her coffee and leaned back in her chair, and Mara suddenly had the feeling she was being interviewed rather than terminated. It was disorienting, like standing on ground that kept shifting under her feet. "I've worked for Ethan Hale for 12 years, Patricia said. "I knew his father before him. I've seen this company grow from a family business into a global empire. And in all that time, I've watched hundreds of people walk through these doors. Employees, executives, contractors, consultants, people who wanted something, people who deserved something, people who thought they could take something." She paused, and her expression softened in a way that suggested whatever was coming next mattered. "But very few people, almost none, actually, have ever walked into one of our events and risked everything to defend someone they barely knew, someone who couldn't do anything for them in return, someone whose name they'd only learned that week." Mara's throat tightened. She hadn't expected kindness, hadn't prepared for it. Cruelty she knew how to handle, but this gentle acknowledgement of what she'd done and why she'd done it threatened to crack open something she'd been holding carefully closed since last night. "Marcus Chen is going to be fine," Patricia continued. "He's at Mount Sinai being treated for exhaustion and dehydration. His daughter's medical bills are being covered by our company insurance, retroactively adjusted as of this morning. And when he's ready to return to work, he'll find that his schedule has been modified to ensure he never has to work double shifts again." That's good." Mara's voice came out rough. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank yourself. None of that would have happened if you hadn't spoken up." Patricia picked up her coffee again, took a deliberate sip. "Now, let's talk about your employment status." Here it came, the professional phrasing that would mean the same thing as "get out," but would sound more civilized. Mara braced herself. Mr. Hale would like to offer you a position in our corporate headquarters. The words didn't make sense. Mara replayed them mentally, trying to find the meaning she'd obviously missed because they couldn't possibly mean what they seemed to mean. I'm sorry, what? A position. Here. Full-time employment with competitive salary, benefits, and, if you're interested, opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than tenure. Patricia's expression remained professional, but something that might have been amusement danced in her eyes. I'm told this is not the response you were expecting. No, I wasn't expecting this. Mara's brain was scrambling, trying to find the trap, the catch, the hidden cost. Why would Mr. Hale want to hire me? I created a massive scene at his event. I contradicted his fiancée in front of Manhattan's elite. I'm a 4-day employee who broke every protocol in the book. You're also someone who saw cruelty happening and refused to look away. Patricia's voice took on a different quality, something that sounded almost personal. You're someone who valued human dignity over personal safety. And you're someone who told the truth in a room full of people who'd spent years learning how to avoid it. She stood, walked to her window that overlooked the city stretching in all directions. Millions of people, millions of stories, millions of daily decisions about courage and cowardice. Ethan Hale built his reputation on integrity, Patricia said quietly. But somewhere along the way, he surrounded himself with people who were very good at making integrity look like whatever was most convenient at the time. People who smiled at cruelty as long as it was well-dressed. People who looked away from problems as long as the problems knew their place. She turned back to Mara. You didn't do that. And that quality, real integrity, not the perform version, is rarer than you think, especially here. Mara's mind was racing. This didn't make sense. None of this made sense. You didn't reward employees for causing scenes. You didn't promote people who embarrassed your fiancé. You didn't... Where's the catch? She asked bluntly. Patricia smiled. A real smile this time, not the professional version. The catch is that the position I'm offering is in our foundation oversight department. You'd be working directly with me, reviewing grant applications, conducting site visits to organizations we fund, ensuring that our charitable donations are actually creating the change they're supposed to create. That sounds like meaningful work. It is. It's also work that requires someone willing to write reports that might make powerful people uncomfortable. Someone willing to tell donors no when their pet projects don't meet our standards. Someone willing to stand between money and ego and say this isn't right, even when it costs them personally. The implication landed like a stone in deep water. You're saying Lydia won't like this. I'm saying Lydia Crow is currently in Mr. Hale's office having a very loud discussion about your immediate termination and possible legal action for defamation. Patricia's expression didn't change, which is why I'm having this conversation with you now, while that discussion is still happening. Mara stood up, adrenaline flooding her system. I should go. I shouldn't be here while... Sit down, Miss Quinn. The command was gentle but absolute. You need to understand something about the position you're in right now. Yes, Lydia wants you gone. Yes, she has considerable influence over Ethan. Yes, accepting this job would mean painting a target on your back that might never fully disappear. Patricia moved closer, and her voice dropped to something that sounded almost conspiratorial. But you'd also have protection. My protection. And more importantly, you'd be in a position where speaking truth becomes your job description rather than your liability. Where the very thing that should have gotten you fired becomes the thing that makes you valuable. Why? Mara's voice was barely above a whisper. Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. No. But I know who you are. Patricia's expression softened. I grew up in Atlanta in the 60s and 70s. I know what it costs to speak up when everyone around you is choosing silence. I know what it feels like to watch injustice happen and have to calculate whether you can afford to do anything about it. And I know how rare it is to find someone who does the math and chooses courage anyway. She returned to her desk, pulled out a folder, and slid it across to Mara. This is the formal offer. Salary is listed on page 2. Benefits on page 3. The position starts Monday if you accept, which gives you the weekend to think about it. Mara opened the folder with trembling hands. The salary made her breath catch. It was more than double what she'd been making at the Blackstone. The benefits were comprehensive. The position description talked about evaluation, oversight, and accountability. It was everything she'd never dared to hope for, which meant it was probably too good to be true. "I need you to be honest with me," Mara said, looking up from the papers. "What happens when Lydia wins this argument? What happens when she convinces Mr. Hale that I'm more trouble than I'm worth?" Patricia's smile was sad, but not pitying. "Then you'll have a very good reference letter from me, 3 months of severance pay, and the knowledge that you held your ground for as long as you could. But Miss Quinn?" She leaned forward. "Lydia Crow isn't the only person in this building with influence. And she's not the only person Ethan Hale listens to." Before Mara could process that statement, Patricia's desk phone buzzed. She answered with practiced efficiency. "Yes?" A pause. "I see. Send her in." She hung up and looked at Mara with an expression that suggested bracing for impact. That was front desk. Lydia Crow is on her way up. Apparently, her discussion with Ethan didn't go the way she wanted. Mara's stomach dropped. "Should I leave? You can sit right there and finish your coffee." Patricia's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "This is my office. You're my guest. And if Lydia Crow wants to have another conversation about appropriate workplace behavior, I'm more than happy to facilitate it." 30 seconds later, the door burst open without a knock. Lydia Crow looked like she'd spent the morning being told no by people who usually said yes, and she'd brought all that accumulated fury into Patricia's office like a storm system looking for landfall. Her white designer outfit was perfect. Her hair was perfect. But her expression was fractured rage barely contained by expensive breeding. Her eyes locked onto Mara like targeting systems. "You." The word was poison. "You're still here." Mara stood slowly, instinctively, though whether to appear less threatening or to prepare for defense, she couldn't quite say. "Miss Crow." "Don't you Miss Crow me." Lydia's voice rose with each word. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Any concept of the damage you've caused?" "Lydia." Patricia's voice cut through the building hysteria like a knife. "Unless you have official business with my department, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "Official business?" Lydia spun toward Patricia, and her laugh was brittle enough to draw blood. "Your department is harboring the woman who publicly defamed me in front of 200 witnesses. Your department is apparently trying to reward someone who should have been terminated immediately. I'd say that's fairly official business." "Miss Quinn didn't defame you. She accurately described behavior that multiple witnesses observed and can corroborate." Patricia stood, and somehow she seemed taller than Lydia, despite being shorter. "And since when do you determine hiring decisions for the Hale Foundation Oversight Department?" "Since I became the public face of that foundation." Lydia's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Since I started bringing in donors who actually matter. Since I made myself indispensable to this company's charitable reputation." "You made yourself visible," Patricia corrected quietly. "That's not the same thing as indispensable." The silence that followed felt like the moment before thunder. Lydia's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, fury, calculation, and finally settling on cold determination. "I want her fired." She pointed at Mara without looking at her, as if direct acknowledgement would give Mara too much importance. "I want her gone from this building, blacklisted from every hospitality position in Manhattan, and I want a formal apology issued to me and every guest who witnessed her outburst." "No." Patricia's answer was simple, final. "Excuse me?" "I said no. Miss Quinn is being offered a position in my department. Whether she accepts is her decision, not yours. And the only apology being issued is the one Ethan will be sending to Marcus Chen and his family for allowing the environment that led to his collapse." Lydia's mask cracked completely. "You cannot be serious. You cannot possibly think—" "I think exactly what I observed," Patricia interrupted. "I think you publicly humiliated a hardworking employee for a minor oversight. I think you escalated a non-issue into a crisis because you could. And I think when someone finally called you on that behavior, you attempted to physically assault her rather than examine your own conduct. Ethan stopped that." But Lydia's voice reached a register that suggested she was used to winning arguments through volume when logic failed. "He contradicted me in front of everyone. He humiliated me." He stopped you from committing assault in front of 200 witnesses, Patricia corrected. He saved you from making a terrible situation catastrophically worse. You might consider thanking him. Lydia's breathing had gone rapid and shallow. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and her eyes held something that looked less like anger and more like genuine panic, like watching control slip through fingers that had always been able to hold whatever they grasped. If she stays, Lydia said, her voice dropping to something that would have been threatening if it didn't sound so desperate, I go. I will not work in any capacity with this company if she remains employed here. You tell Ethan that. You tell him he has to choose. Mara's heart was hammering so hard she thought everyone in the room must hear it. This was it. The moment where reality reasserted itself and powerful people remembered which side their bread was buttered on. Lydia Crow brought connections, donations, influence. What did Mara bring? 4 days of employment and 1 moment of courage that everyone would forget as soon as it became inconvenient to remember. Patricia studied Lydia for a long moment. Then she smiled, not unkindly, but with the sadness of someone delivering news that should have been obvious all along. Then I suppose you should start packing your office. The color drained from Lydia's face. What? If you're issuing ultimatums about who can and cannot work here, then you've misunderstood your position in this company. Patricia's voice stayed gentle, which somehow made the words hit harder. You're Ethan's fiancée. You're a foundation board member. But you're not an executive. You don't make personnel decisions. And you certainly don't get to veto hiring choices in departments you don't oversee. I'm more than just his fiancée. Are you? Patricia tilted her head slightly. Because from where I'm standing, that's exactly what you are. A partner Ethan chose 5 years ago when he was a different person facing different pressures. But partnerships are supposed to bring out the best in people, Lydia. They're supposed to make both people better versions of themselves. She paused, and something that looked almost like pity crossed her expression. What have you brought out in him except compromise and resignation? The question hung in the air like smoke. Lydia stood frozen, her mouth working soundlessly as if trying to form arguments that wouldn't quite materialize. And Mara, watching from her position near the window, felt like she was witnessing something crack that had been under pressure for years. I've given him everything, Lydia finally whispered. Connections, status, a future that looks exactly like his past, Patricia interrupted gently. The same circles, the same expectations, the same careful performance of values rather than the actual practice of them. She moved around her desk, and for the first time since Lydia had burst in, her expression shifted from professional to something more human, more compassionate. Lydia, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who learned very young that power equals safety. And you've spent your entire adult life trying to accumulate enough power to never feel unsafe again. But power without empathy isn't safety. It's just isolation wearing expensive clothes. Lydia's eyes were bright with unshed tears that seemed to surprise her as much as anyone. You don't know anything about me. I know what I see. And what I see is someone who's terrified that if she stops performing control for even a moment, everything she's built will collapse. Patricia's voice was almost kind now. But Lydia, it already is collapsing. It started collapsing the moment you raised your hand to strike someone weaker than you because they told a truth you didn't want to hear. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Lydia drew herself up with visible effort, reassembling the mask piece by piece until her expression was almost normal again, almost controlled. Ethan will hear about this conversation. I certainly hope so. He'll hear about your insubordination, your complete disregard for my position, your protection of someone who publicly attacked me. Good. Then we'll finally have an honest conversation about what actually happened last night instead of your version of events. Patricia returned to her desk, her posture signaling that this meeting was over. Close the door on your way out, please. Lydia looked between Patricia and Mara, and for just a moment her mask slipped completely. What showed underneath wasn't rage or cruelty or any of the emotions Mara expected. It was fear. Pure, undiluted fear of someone watching their entire constructed reality crumble and having no idea how to stop it. Then she turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her like a final act of petty defiance. Patricia closed it herself, slowly, deliberately. Then she returned to her chair and picked up her coffee like nothing particularly unusual had just occurred. "Well," she said mildly, "that went about as expected." Mara's legs felt weak. She sat down heavily, her mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. "Miss Reeves, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. You didn't ask for any of this." "No, but I caused it. If you hadn't spoken up, Marcus Chen would still be working himself into an early grave while being treated like disposable equipment. Lydia would still be using employees as stress toys. And Ethan would still be trapped in a relationship that's been slowly strangling everything good in him for years." Patricia's eyes were sharp. "You didn't cause this, Miss Quinn. You just forced everyone to finally look at what's been happening all along." Mara's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "What happens now?" "Now?" Patricia checked her watch. "Now you take that offer letter home and think about whether you really want to work somewhere that comes with this level of complexity. Monday morning, if you decide yes, you come back here and we get started. If you decide no, I'll respect that choice and write you the best reference letter of your life." "And Lydia?" "Lydia will do what Lydia always does. She'll regroup, she'll strategize, she'll find new pressure points and exploit them." Patricia's expression was matter-of-fact rather than worried. But for the first time in 5 years, she'll be doing it without the certainty that everyone will automatically take her side. That changes the game considerably. Mara stood on shaky legs, clutching the offer folder like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. "Thank you for everything, for defending me, for seeing something in me that might be worth defending." "I didn't defend you, Miss Quinn. I just refused to participate in pretending that what happened last night was anything other than what it obviously was." Patricia stood as well, extending her hand for a shake. "The courage was yours. I just made sure it wasn't wasted." The handshake was firm and warm and felt like a promise of something Mara couldn't quite name. Solidarity, maybe, or the recognition that came from one person who'd fought battles acknowledging another person just entering the arena. Mara left Patricia's office and made it halfway to the elevators before her legs gave out and she had to lean against a wall for support. Her whole body was trembling with aftershock, with the accumulated tension of 2 confrontations in 12 hours, with the sheer impossibility of everything that had just occurred. She was being offered a real job, with real pay, doing real work that mattered, and all she had to do was accept that she'd be walking into a war zone where one side had money, connections, and 5 years of accumulated power, while her side had integrity and one executive assistant who'd apparently decided to burn bridges on her behalf. The smart choice was obvious. Take Patricia's reference letter. Find a quiet job somewhere that nobody important ever visited. Keep her head down and her mouth shut and survive the way she'd always survived, by being small enough to escape notice. The right choice was less obvious. But Mara was starting to understand that right and smart rarely pointed in the same direction. She made it to the lobby, pushed through the revolving doors, and stood on the street gulping air like she'd been underwater. The city moved around her with its usual indifference. Millions of people living millions of stories, most of them too busy surviving their own dramas to notice hers. Her phone buzzed, a text from Patricia. "Whatever you decide, you should know that your courage yesterday has already changed things here. Sometimes that has to be enough." Mara stared at those words until they blurred. Then she started walking toward the subway, toward home, toward the weekend she'd been given to decide whether she was brave enough to keep being brave. Behind her, the Hale Industries Tower stretched toward the sky, full of people making decisions that would ripple outward in ways they'd never fully understand. And inside it somewhere, Ethan Hale and Lydia Crow were having a conversation that would determine more than just Mara's employment status. They were deciding what kind of people they wanted to be, what kind of world they wanted to build, and whether integrity was something you performed for cameras or something you practiced even when it cost you everything. Mara didn't know how any of that would end, but for the first time in her life, she knew how her own story would continue. With her eyes open, her voice steady, her courage tested but not broken. Whatever came next, she'd face it standing up. The weekend stretched before Mara like a test she hadn't studied for. Saturday morning found her in her tiny apartment staring at Patricia's offer letter spread across her kitchen table like tarot cards predicting an uncertain future. The numbers were real. The position was real. But the whole situation felt like standing on ice that could crack at any moment, plunging her into water too deep and cold to survive. She made coffee and tried to think strategically, practically, the way someone smarter would approach this decision. But every time she started building a logical argument for or against accepting the position, her mind kept circling back to Marcus Chen's face when he'd collapsed, to Lydia's hand raised to strike, to that moment when she'd stepped forward, knowing exactly what it would cost and doing it anyway. Her phone rang Sunday afternoon. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Miss Quinn? This is Ethan Hale." Mara's coffee cup froze halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully, buying herself 3 seconds to remember how to form words. "Mr. Hale, I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I imagine not." His voice sounded different than it had at the gala. Less polished, more tired, more human. "I'm calling to apologize." "For what?" "For allowing an environment where what happened Friday night was possible. For not intervening sooner. For creating a situation where you had to risk your livelihood to do what I should have done myself." He paused, and she heard something that sounded like genuine regret. "I've been thinking about your words. About power not making someone right, just powerful." Mara sat down slowly, her legs suddenly unreliable. "Mr. Hale, you don't need to apologize to me. You stopped Lydia before I stopped her from making it worse. That's not the same as stopping it from happening in the first place." His voice hardened slightly, though the edge seemed directed inward. "Patricia told me about your conversation, about the offer. I want you to know that offer stands regardless of any other circumstances, regardless of what Lydia wants or threatens or demands. She issued an ultimatum. She issues a lot of things. Doesn't mean I have to accept them." He exhaled slowly. "Miss Quinn, I need you to understand something. I've spent 5 years building a relationship on the assumption that love means compromise, that partnership means choosing your battles carefully and accepting that some things aren't worth the fight. But watching you on Friday night, watching you risk everything for someone you barely knew, it made me realize I've been compromising things that should never have been negotiable." Mara's throat felt tight. "What happens now, between you and Lydia?" "That's being decided." The careful neutrality in his voice suggested decisions were still in progress, outcomes still uncertain. But, regardless of how that resolves, I need people around me who tell the truth, who see problems and name them instead of learning to look away. Patricia says you're that person. Friday night proved she's right. Friday night proved I don't know when to keep my mouth shut. No. It proved you know exactly when keeping your mouth shut becomes participation in cruelty. His voice softened. "The position is yours if you want it, Miss Quinn. No strings, no conditions, just the expectation that you'll bring that same integrity to everything you do. Can you live with that?" Mara looked at the offer letter, at the numbers that could change her life, at the job description that talked about accountability and oversight, and making sure money meant more than photo opportunities. She thought about Marcus Chen and his daughter's hospital bills, about all the other Marcus Chens working themselves to exhaustion in the shadows of wealth that never noticed them breaking. "Yes," she said quietly, "I can live with that." "Good. Welcome to Hale Industries, Miss Quinn. Patricia will handle the details Monday morning." He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice carried something that sounded almost like relief. "Thank you for reminding me what it looks like when someone actually practices the values I've been performing." He hung up before she could respond, leaving Mara holding her phone and trying to process the surreal reality that she'd just been personally welcomed to her new job by a billionaire who'd spent the last 72 hours watching his life reorganize itself around one moment of truth. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything feel both more real and more fragile. Mara dressed carefully, professional but not trying too hard, confident but not arrogant. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone who'd somehow stumbled from unemployment to corporate employment in 4 days by doing the exact thing every survival instinct screamed against. Patricia met her at reception with a smile that suggested she'd expected exactly this outcome. "Welcome back, Miss Quinn. Ready for your first day?" "As ready as I'll ever be." That's more honest than most people manage. Patricia led her through corridors that looked different now that Mara had legitimate reason to be walking them. We'll start with HR paperwork, then I'll show you your office and introduce you to the team. Fair warning, everyone knows who you are and why you're here. There will be curiosity, some skepticism, probably some resentment from people who think you got this position through drama rather than qualifications. Did I? Patricia stopped walking and turned to face her directly. You got this position because you demonstrated the exact qualities this role requires. What happened Friday was a field test you didn't know you were taking. You passed with distinction. Anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to discuss it with me. Mara's office was small but real. Actual walls, actual door, actual window overlooking the city. Her name was already on a placard outside. Mara Quinn, Program Oversight Analyst. She stared at it for a long moment, letting the reality sink in that this was hers, earned and offered and accepted. The team meets in 15 minutes, Patricia said, checking her watch. Conference room C. I'll introduce you, explain your role, and then we'll dive into current projects. Most of them are straightforward evaluation work, but there's one that's been causing problems. What kind of problems? The kind where a major donor is pushing a pet project that doesn't meet our standards, but nobody wants to tell him no because he's contributed 8 figures over the past 3 years. Patricia's expression was neutral, but her eyes held something sharper. The preliminary evaluation recommended rejection. The donor went over the analyst's head directly to the board. Now it's stuck in political limbo while everyone tries to figure out how to keep the money without compromising our integrity. That sounds like exactly the kind of situation I'm supposed to help with. It is, which is why it'll probably be assigned to you by the end of the week. Patricia smiled thinly. Welcome to the complicated parts, Miss Quinn. The conference room held 7 people who all turned to watch as Mara entered. She recognized the looks, curiosity mixed with calculation, people trying to decide whether she was ally, competition, or liability. Patricia made introductions with professional efficiency, and Mara filed away names and faces and roles while trying to project competence she didn't entirely feel. Most of you have heard by now about the incident at Friday's gala, Patricia said once everyone was seated. What you may not have heard is the full context. Marcus Chen, one of our event staff, collapsed from exhaustion after working double shifts to cover his daughter's medical expenses. The incident that preceded his collapse involved public humiliation over a minor oversight. Miss Quinn intervened. She spoke up when everyone else remained silent, and that intervention ultimately led to policy changes that ensure our staff won't be placed in similar situations going forward. She paused, letting that information settle into the room's atmosphere. Miss Quinn isn't here because she caused a scene. She's here because she demonstrated the core principle of this department, that money and power don't excuse cruelty, and someone needs to be willing to say so even when it's uncomfortable. That's what we do. We evaluate whether our resources are being used to create genuine positive change or just to make wealthy people feel philanthropic. Sometimes that evaluation makes people angry. Sometimes it costs us donations. But it ensures that when the Hale Foundation puts its name on something, that endorsement actually means something. A woman in her 40s with severe glasses and sharper eyes spoke up. With respect, Patricia, there's a difference between evaluation work and publicly confronting board members' families. How do we know Miss Quinn understands where those boundaries are? That's a fair question, Rachel. Patricia looked at Mara. Would you like to answer it? Mara took a breath, feeling 7 pairs of eyes measuring her response. I don't think there's a universal answer. Context matters. Friday night, someone was being publicly degraded for entertainment while working double shifts to keep his daughter alive. That crossed a line that had nothing to do with employment hierarchy and everything to do with basic human dignity. I spoke up because nobody else would. She paused, organizing thoughts that were still forming even as she spoke them. But you're right that evaluation work requires different strategies. Documentation instead of confrontation, evidence instead of emotion, building cases that make recommendations undeniable rather than making scenes that make them controversial. She met Rachel's eyes directly. I'm here to learn how to channel what I did Friday into work that creates lasting change instead of just dramatic moments. If I can't do that, then I don't belong in this position. The silence that followed felt like judgment being rendered. Then Rachel nodded slowly. That's a better answer than I expected. Welcome to the team, Miss Quinn. The meeting continued with updates on current projects, grant evaluations, site visits, follow-up reports on previously funded initiatives. Mara absorbed information like someone drowning trying to memorize the ocean, knowing she'd need weeks to fully understand the systems and processes everyone else took for granted. But she also noticed something else. When Patricia talked about evaluation standards, about holding grantees accountable, about saying no to projects that sounded good but lacked substance, the team responded with something that looked almost like relief. Like they'd been fighting these battles alone for too long and were grateful for reinforcement. After the meeting, a younger analyst named David approached her with tentative friendliness. "Just so you know, what you did Friday? That took guts. Most people here have wanted to tell Lydia Crow where to shove her opinions for years. You're kind of a legend already. I'm kind of unemployed if I'd worked anywhere else." "Yeah, well, you work here, and here, at least in this department, truth actually matters." He grinned. "Plus, watching Patricia shut Lydia down has been the highlight of everyone's year. We're all hoping you survive long enough to do more damage to people who desperately deserve it." Mara wasn't sure whether to be flattered or terrified by that sentiment. She settled for cautiously optimistic and spent the rest of the day drowning in orientation materials, system passwords, and the bewildering complexity of foundation operations. Tuesday morning brought her first real assignment. Patricia dropped a thick folder on her desk with the satisfaction of someone delivering a test she knew would be challenging, but fair. The Meridian Youth Initiative, proposed by Harrison Whitfield, one of our largest donors, supposed to provide tech education to underserved communities. Budget of $5 million over 3 years. The preliminary evaluation flagged multiple concerns: vague metrics, questionable partnerships, lack of community input. Whitfield pushed back hard. He wants approval by end of month. Mara opened the folder and started scanning. Within 5 pages, she could see the problems: glossy photos and inspiring rhetoric, but no concrete plans for curriculum development, teacher training, or actual community engagement. It read like a vanity project designed to look impressive in press releases while accomplishing minimal actual change. What happens if I recommend rejection? Then we reject it, and Whitfield probably threatens to pull future funding, and the board has to decide whether integrity or money matters more. Patricia's expression was unreadable. Your job is to evaluate honestly and make the strongest case you can for whatever conclusion the evidence supports. Politics comes later, truth comes first. Mara spent the next 3 days living inside that folder. She reviewed budgets and timelines. She researched the partner organizations. 2 were legitimate, 3 had questionable track records. 1 was essentially a shell company run by Whitfield's nephew. She compared the proposal against successful similar programs and found gaps everywhere that mattered. Friday afternoon, she finished her evaluation report. 23 pages of careful analysis, documented concerns, and clear recommendations. The conclusion was unambiguous. The Meridian Youth Initiative as currently proposed failed to meet foundation standards and should be rejected pending substantial revision. She sent it to Patricia with fingers that trembled slightly from either exhaustion or anticipation of consequences. Patricia's response came within an hour. "Excellent work, exactly what we needed. Prepare to present this to the board Monday. And Miss Quinn, get ready for Whitfield to be extremely unhappy with you." Monday morning arrived with the weight of pending conflict. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main conference room, the one with the long table and the expensive chairs and the wall of windows that looked out over Manhattan like a command center for people who moved millions like chess pieces. Mara arrived 15 minutes early, wearing her best suit and carrying printed copies of her report. Patricia was already there, reviewing notes with the calm efficiency of someone who'd attended 1,000 board meetings and survived them all. "Remember," Patricia said quietly, "present the facts. Answer questions directly. Don't apologize for your conclusions unless you actually think they're wrong. And whatever Whitfield says, don't take it personally. He's going to attack the analysis to avoid addressing the actual problems." The board members filed in gradually. Mara recognized some from the gala: the tech mogul, the senator, a fashion designer whose work appeared in museums, and Harrison Whitfield himself, 73 years old, silver-haired, carrying the particular confidence of someone who'd spent decades having doors opened before he reached them. Ethan entered last, his expression professionally neutral. He nodded to the board members, acknowledged Patricia with a slight smile, and let his eyes rest on Mara for just a moment. Something in that look suggested he knew exactly how difficult this was about to become, and was sorry she had to go through it. Then he took his seat at the head of the table, and the meeting began. Routine business came first: budget approvals, grant renewals, status updates on ongoing programs. Mara half listened while her brain rehearsed her presentation, anticipating questions, preparing defenses for conclusions she knew were right, but couldn't prove wouldn't cause explosions. Next item, Ethan said finally, consulting his agenda. The Meridian Youth Initiative proposal. Patricia, I understand your department completed the evaluation. We did. Miss Quinn will present the findings. Every eye in the room turned to Mara. She stood on legs that felt steadier than she'd expected, distributed her reports, and launched into the presentation she'd practiced until she could deliver it in her sleep. She kept it factual, highlighted the proposal's stated goals and compared them against evidence of capacity to achieve those goals, walked through budget concerns, partnership issues, and the absence of meaningful community engagement, showed examples of similar successful programs, and demonstrated where this proposal fell short. She spoke for 12 minutes. Nobody interrupted. Whitfield's face progressed through shades of red like a sunset viewed in fast forward. In conclusion, Mara said, meeting the eyes of everyone at the table, the Meridian Youth Initiative as currently structured does not meet foundation standards for evidence-based programming, fiscal responsibility, or community partnership. The recommendation is to reject this proposal and invite Mr. Whitfield to submit a revised version that addresses these concerns. Silence. Then Whitfield laughed, sharp and humorless. This is absurd. Absolutely absurd. He looked at Ethan like expecting immediate agreement. This proposal represents months of work by experienced professionals. And you're telling me some junior analyst with what? A week of employment, thinks she knows better than people who've been doing this work for decades? Mr. Whitfield, Patricia interjected smoothly, Miss Quinn's tenure here is irrelevant to the quality of her analysis. Would you like to address any specific concerns raised in the evaluation, or would you prefer to attack her credentials instead of engaging with the evidence? Whitfield's face went darker. I've contributed over $20 million to this foundation over 8 years. I've opened doors you people couldn't reach without me. And this is how you show appreciation? By having some nobody tell me my work isn't good enough? Harrison. Ethan's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. The question isn't whether you've been generous. You have been. The question is whether this specific proposal meets our standards. If the evaluation found problems, those problems exist regardless of your past contributions. Then the evaluation is flawed. Whitfield turned to Mara with eyes that promised consequences. Let me guess. You're the same woman who made a scene at the gala, who publicly humiliated Lydia, who apparently makes a habit of biting hands that feed her. I'm the same woman who evaluated your proposal against the same standards we apply to every grant application, Mara replied, keeping her voice level. If you'd like to discuss specific concerns, budget allocations, partnership vetting, community input processes, I'm happy to do that. But my presence at the gala has nothing to do with whether your proposal meets foundation standards. Everything has to do with everything when you're dealing with institutional funding. Whitfield stood, and his voice rose with him. You want to know why programs like mine struggle? Because people like you sit in offices and find reasons to say no, while children who need help wait for perfectionism that never comes. That's not what's happening here, Mara said quietly. What's happening here is that the evaluation found a proposal that looks impressive but lacks substance, that promises transformation without demonstrating capacity to deliver it, that wants $5 million based on intentions rather than evidence. She paused, and something in her shifted, from defense to offense, from responding to leading. You said children are waiting for help. You're absolutely right. They are. Which is exactly why we can't afford to fund programs that sound good but won't actually work. Every dollar we spend on initiatives that fail is a dollar. We're not spending on initiatives that succeed. So yes, we require evidence, we require concrete plans, we require demonstrated capacity, not because we're perfectionist gatekeepers, but because we take seriously the responsibility that comes with other people's money and other people's futures. The silence that followed felt different than previous silences, heavier, more charged, like watching a scale tip towards some inevitable conclusion. Senator Whitmore, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward. Harrison, I've read the evaluation. The concerns are legitimate. The question isn't whether Miss Quinn is qualified to raise them. The question is whether you're willing to address them. I'm not willing to have my work questioned by someone who has no idea what real philanthropy requires. Whitfield grabbed his briefcase with angry efficiency. This is your decision, Ethan. Either you override this absurd recommendation or you lose my support entirely. Future funding, future connections, everything. He let that threat hang in the air like smoke from a gun just fired. Ethan stood slowly. His expression was calm, but something in his eyes suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. Maybe not this specific confrontation, but this kind of test where values met pressure and he'd finally have to choose which one bent. Harrison, you've been a valued partner for years, but partnerships work both ways. You don't get to bypass our evaluation process because you've contributed generously in the past. That's not how integrity works. Integrity. Whitfield repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Let me tell you about integrity, Ethan. Integrity is keeping commitments to people who've supported you. Integrity is loyalty to donors who opened doors when you needed them. Integrity is not letting some self-righteous analyst with delusions of importance destroy relationships that took years to build. No, Ethan said quietly. That's not integrity. That's transaction, and I'm starting to understand the difference. He looked at Mara then, and something in that look felt like acknowledgement, like recognition, like maybe Friday night had started a process that was still unfolding in ways none of them had anticipated. The evaluation stands. The recommendation is accepted. We'll reject the current proposal and invite you to revise and resubmit if you choose, but we won't compromise our standards because the alternative is uncomfortable. Whitfield's face went rigid. You'll regret this, Ethan. Both of you. He stormed out, leaving behind a silence that felt like the aftermath of something breaking that had been fragile for years. The senator was first to speak. Well, that was unpleasant but necessary. Miss Quinn, your evaluation was thorough and fair. I support the recommendation. Agreement rippled around the table. The fashion designer nodded. The tech mogul made a note. Patricia allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Motion carries, Ethan said formally. Meridian Youth Initiative proposal rejected pending substantial revision. Patricia, please work with communications on appropriate messaging. The meeting concluded with remaining business, routine approvals, budget adjustments, nothing that carried the weight of what had just occurred. Mara gathered her papers with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline crash, from the realization that she'd just participated in turning away millions of dollars based on evidence she'd compiled, from the awareness that she'd made another powerful enemy in a city where power had long memory. As people filed out, Ethan approached her. That took courage, Miss Quinn. It took reading comprehension. The problems weren't exactly subtle. No, but naming them publicly, defending your conclusions against someone who's used to getting his way, that took courage. He paused, and his voice dropped slightly. Whitfield was right about one thing. You're starting to make a habit of telling uncomfortable truths to people who prefer comfortable lies. That's valuable. It's also dangerous. Be careful. I'm starting to think careful and honest don't exist in the same space. They don't, which is why honest is rare. He glanced toward the door where Whitfield had exited. Thank you for making this easier than it would have been if I'd had to make that call alone. He left before she could respond, leaving Mara standing in the expensive conference room, trying to process the surreal reality that a billionaire had just thanked her for helping him find his backbone. Patricia was waiting in the hallway with an expression that managed to combine pride and concern. You did well in there. Better than well. But you understand what just happened, right? Whitfield has connections everywhere. He'll make sure people know the Hale Foundation rejected his proposal. He'll paint you as the obstacle. There will be consequences. I know. And you're still glad you did it? Mara thought about that question. About children in underserved communities who deserve programs that actually worked rather than programs that looked good in press releases. About the responsibility that came with evaluating how millions of dollars got spent. About standing in rooms full of powerful people and choosing evidence over politics. Yeah, she said finally. I am. Good. Because it's about to get worse. Patricia's expression shifted. Lydia's been making calls. She's convinced 3 board members that you're a disruptive influence who needs to be removed. They're pushing for a vote to overturn your hiring at next month's meeting. Mara's stomach dropped. Can they do that? Technically, yes. Practically, only if Ethan allows it. Patricia's voice was matter-of-fact. Which means the next 4 weeks are going to determine whether your courage gets rewarded or whether it just made you an extremely public example of what happens when regular people challenge power. She walked away, leaving Mara alone in the corridor with the weight of understanding that this wasn't over. It was barely beginning. Every day she showed up, every evaluation she completed, every time she chose truth over convenience, she was painting a target bigger and brighter. But walking away now would mean accepting that people like Lydia Crow and Harrison Whitfield got to define what courage cost and whether it was worth paying. Mara returned to her office and sat at her desk looking out over the city. Somewhere down there, Marcus Chen was home with his daughter, recovering, not working double shifts, protected by policy changes that existed because someone had finally refused to look away. Somewhere in this building, Ethan Hale was making decisions about what kind of leader he wanted to be, what kind of foundation he wanted to run, what kind of future he wanted to build. And somewhere, Lydia Crow was planning her next move in a game Mara hadn't realized she was playing until she was already several moves deep. But none of that changed the fundamental equation. Cruelty was still cruelty, regardless of who performed it. Truth was still truth, regardless of who found it inconvenient. And someone needed to be willing to name both, even when it cost everything. Mara had become that someone. Now she just had to figure out how to survive it. The following 3 weeks moved with the strange, dual quality of time passing both too quickly and too slowly. Days that crawled through evaluation work and meetings, but weeks that seemed to evaporate before Mara could fully grasp what was happening. She developed routines. Morning coffee at her desk while reviewing grant applications. Lunch at a small deli 3 blocks away where nobody recognized her, and she could eat in anonymous peace. Afternoons spent documenting site visits or analyzing budget proposals with the kind of meticulous attention that made Rachel grudgingly admit she might actually know what she was doing. But beneath the surface normalcy, pressure was building. She felt it in the way certain board members looked at her during meetings, calculating, measuring, deciding. She felt it in the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. She felt it in the 3 anonymous emails she'd received suggesting she might want to consider employment elsewhere before things became uncomfortable for everyone involved. Patricia remained steady and supportive, but even she looked worried. Lydia's been methodical, she told Mara during one of their weekly check-ins. She's not attacking you directly. She's building a case that you're inexperienced, impulsive, and creating conflicts that damage the foundation's relationships. 3 board members are listening. If she gets 4, she can force a vote. What does Ethan say? Ethan is fighting battles on multiple fronts right now. Patricia's expression suggested those battles were more complicated than she could or would discuss. But he's holding the line, so far. The so far hung between them like a sword suspended by threads getting thinner each day. On a Tuesday afternoon in her 4th week, Mara returned from a site visit to find her office door ajar. She'd locked it. She was certain she'd locked it. But now it stood open just enough to be unmistakable, and her carefully organized desk had been disturbed, papers shifted, files not quite where she'd left them. She called security immediately. They reviewed footage and found nothing. A convenient glitch had caused the cameras on her floor to malfunction for exactly 17 minutes that afternoon, long enough for someone to enter, search, and leave without being recorded. What were they looking for? David asked when she told him about it. His usual casual friendliness had been replaced by genuine concern. I don't know, maybe ammunition, some evaluation I did that they can claim was biased or incomplete, some email I wrote that sounds bad out of context. Mara rubbed her temples where a headache was building. Or maybe they were just trying to make me feel unsafe. Mission accomplished. She started taking her laptop home every night, started keeping sensitive documents in encrypted files, started checking her office each morning for signs of intrusion. It felt paranoid and necessary in equal measure, and she hated that both could be true simultaneously. Thursday of that week brought the incident that would change everything. Mara was in the archives, a climate-controlled room in the basement where physical copies of old grant applications were stored, researching precedents for a current evaluation. The room was quiet, isolated, perfect for concentration, which was probably why Lydia chose it. "Miss Quinn, how industrious!" Mara looked up from the file she'd been reading to find Lydia standing in the doorway. No assistant, no witness, just the two of them in a room 3 floors below, where anyone might hear if something went wrong. "Miss Crow," Mara kept her voice neutral, professional. "Can I help you with something?" "Actually, I thought I might help you." Lydia stepped inside, letting the heavy door close behind her with a sound like finality. "You seem to be struggling with understanding how things work here. I thought a private conversation might clarify certain realities." She moved closer, and Mara felt her body tense involuntarily. Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that being alone with Lydia was exactly the kind of situation where accidents happened and stories got told that had nothing to do with truth. "I'm not struggling," Mara said carefully. "I'm doing my job, evaluating proposals, making recommendations based on evidence." "Is that what you call it?" Lydia's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "I call it systematically destroying relationships that took years to build. Harrison Whitfield was one of our most reliable donors. Now he's telling everyone the Hale Foundation has been taken over by ideological purists who care more about perfection than results. If by perfection you mean basic standards of accountability, then yes, we care about that. Don't be clever with me." Lydia's voice dropped to something colder. "You think you're brave, standing up for principles. You think you're some kind of hero, speaking truth to power, but you're just an employee, Miss Quinn, a replaceable cog in a machine that will keep running long after you're gone. Then why are you here?" Mara stood, refusing to be literally looked down upon. "If I'm so irrelevant, why bother with private threats in basement archives?" Something flickered across Lydia's face, surprise maybe that Mara wasn't cowering. Then it hardened into something uglier. "Because you need to understand what you've cost me. Ethan and I were perfect together, perfect partnership, perfect image, perfect future. And then you, some nobody with delusions of importance, you spoke up at exactly the wrong moment and made him doubt everything." "I didn't make him doubt anything. I just refused to pretend cruelty was acceptable." "That cruelty?" Lydia laughed, brittle and sharp. "That was me maintaining standards. That was me ensuring excellence. But you turned it into some dramatic referendum on character, and now Ethan looks at me like I'm someone he doesn't recognize." Her voice was rising, control slipping, and Mara realized with creeping horror that this wasn't calculation anymore. This was someone breaking, someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse and needing to blame someone, anyone, for the wreckage. "Miss Crow, I think you should leave. You think you've won." Lydia stepped closer, invading personal space, and her eyes held something desperate and dangerous. "You think that because Ethan defended you, because Patricia protects you, because you survived this long, that you're safe. But you're not. I will make sure you're not." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm promising you." Lydia's voice went quiet, which somehow made it worse. "I have spent my entire adult life building power carefully, methodically, ensuring I never had to depend on anyone's mercy ever again. And I will use every bit of that power to make sure you understand exactly what happens to people who get in my way." Mara's phone was in her pocket. She could record this, document the threat, but pulling it out now would escalate an already volatile situation, and they were alone in a basement archive where Lydia could claim anything happened. "I'm leaving now," Mara said, trying to step around Lydia toward the door. Lydia's hand shot out and grabbed Mara's arm, hard enough to hurt, hard enough to leave marks. "We're not done talking." "Yes, we are." Mara pulled free, heart hammering. "Touch me again and I'll file assault charges." "With what proof? Who do you think they'll believe? A respected board member's fiancée, or a 4-week employee with a history of making scenes?" The calculation in that question was terrifying because it was accurate. Lydia had been playing this game far longer than Mara had even known it existed. She'd set this up carefully, No witnesses, no cameras, just her word against Mara's, and her word carried the weight of wealth and connections, and 5 years of being the person everyone wanted to please. But Mara had been surviving in systems rigged against her since childhood. She'd learned young that power wasn't the only currency, that truth had its own weight if you held it carefully enough. The difference between us, Mara said quietly, is that I'm not afraid of what people will believe. I'm only afraid of becoming someone who lies to make things easier. You might destroy my career, you might make sure I never work in philanthropy again, but you can't make me compromise who I am, and every day that I don't compromise, I win something you lost years ago. Lydia's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: rage, disbelief, something that looked almost like pain. You self-righteous little... The archive door opened. They both froze. Patricia stood in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp enough to cut. Behind her stood 2 security guards whose presence suggested this wasn't a social visit. Miss Crow? I've been looking for you. There's an urgent matter requiring board attention. If you'll come with me? It wasn't a request. Lydia's hand was still raised, her posture aggressive, and even she seemed to realize how this looked. Her confronting a junior employee alone in a basement archive, caught in mid-threat by witnesses whose cameras were definitely working. Of course. Lydia smoothed her expression like pulling on a mask. Miss Quinn and I were just having a professional discussion about evaluation standards. I'm sure you were. Patricia's tone suggested she believed exactly nothing about that statement. Security will escort you upstairs. Miss Quinn, please come to my office when you're ready. Lydia swept out with as much dignity as she could salvage, which wasn't much. The security guards followed at professional distance, and Mara stood in the archive room trying not to shake, trying not to let the aftermath crash through her defenses. Patricia waited until they were alone. Are you hurt? She grabbed my arm. It'll bruise, but nothing serious. Did she threaten you specifically? Mara repeated the conversation as accurately as she could remember, watching Patricia's expression grow progressively grimmer. When she finished, Patricia pulled out her phone and made a call. Ethan, it's Patricia. We have a situation. I need you in my office in 10 minutes. She paused, listening. No, it can't wait. It involves Lydia and Miss Quinn and a confrontation in the archives that security witnessed the aftermath of. Another pause. Yes, I'm serious. 10 minutes. She hung up and looked at Mara with something that might have been sympathy mixed with steel. This ends today. One way or another, this ends today. Ethan's office was on the 49th floor, bigger than Patricia's, more expensive than Mara's entire apartment, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Manhattan like surveying an empire. Abstract art worth 6 figures hung on walls between shelves holding awards and recognitions from 2 decades of business success. And behind a desk that could have served as a landing pad sat Ethan Hale, looking older and more tired than Mara had ever seen him. Lydia was already there, seated in one of the visitor chairs with perfect posture and a carefully constructed expression of confused innocence. She didn't look at Mara when she entered, just kept her gaze fixed on Ethan, like he was the only person in the room who mattered. Patricia closed the door. The click of the lock sounded final. All right, Ethan said quietly. Someone tell me what happened. Patricia gestured to Mara. Miss Quinn, please describe the encounter in the archives. Mara did, keeping her voice steady, sticking to facts, avoiding editorialization. She described Lydia's entrance, the threats, the physical contact, the timing of Patricia's arrival. When she finished, silence filled the room like water rising. Lydia's laugh was perfectly calibrated, just the right note of disbelief mixed with hurt innocence. This is absurd. I went to the archives to retrieve old grant files. Miss Quinn was there. We had a brief, entirely professional conversation about evaluation methodology. She seemed agitated, possibly because she knows her position here is being questioned. I certainly never threatened her or touched her inappropriately. Then why did security find you in an aggressive posture? Patricia's voice was deceptively mild. I don't know what they think they saw, but I assure you it was misinterpreted. Miss Quinn has a history of overreaction and drama. Perhaps this is another example. Show me your arm, Ethan said to Mara. Mara rolled up her sleeve. The bruise was already forming, clear handprint shape, unmistakable. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes looked like the last piece of something breaking that had been cracking for weeks. "Lydia, did you grab Miss Quinn's arm?" "Of course not. She probably did that herself for sympathy. She's proven she's willing to cause scenes for attention." "The security footage will show the timeline," Patricia interjected. "If that bruise appeared after your encounter with Miss Crow, it'll be clear in the recording." Lydia's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, panic flickering through before being buried again. "Then it will show I never touched her. Ethan, you can't possibly believe I would do something like this. You know me." "Do I?" Ethan's voice was quiet in a way that felt more dangerous than shouting. "Because the woman I thought I knew wouldn't humiliate staff for entertainment, wouldn't attempt assault at a public event, wouldn't corner employees in isolated locations. But apparently, I didn't know that woman as well as I thought. I have been nothing but supportive of you and your foundation. You've been controlling and cruel, and I've been ignoring it because it was easier than acknowledging what that meant about my judgment." He stood, moved to the windows, stared out at the city he commanded but couldn't control. 5 years, Lydia. 5 years I told myself that your behavior was just high standards, that your treatment of people was just maintaining excellence, that your cruelty was somehow my problem to manage and smooth over and excuse. "Ethan, I'm not finished." He turned back, and his expression was something Mara had never seen before. Not the polished executive, not the diplomatic negotiator, but something raw and real and furious. "You made me complicit. Every time I stayed silent while you degraded someone, every time I smoothed things over instead of addressing them, every time I chose you over doing what was obviously right, you made me complicit in cruelty I swore I'd never tolerate. That's not fair. It's completely fair, and it ends now." He moved to his desk, pulled open a drawer, retrieved something. An envelope. "This is a letter formally ending our engagement. My lawyers will contact yours about property division and other logistics. You'll remain on the foundation board through the end of the fiscal year, but after that your term will not be renewed." The silence that followed felt like the moment after lightning strikes before thunder arrives, charged and terrible and inevitably destructive. Lydia's carefully constructed mask shattered completely. "You're ending this? Over her?" She pointed at Mara with a hand that shook. "Over some nobody employee who's been here a month. I'm ending this because of who I've become while being with you. Someone who looks away from cruelty because confronting it is inconvenient. Someone who values comfort over integrity. Someone I don't recognize when I look in the mirror." His voice softened, and somehow that made it worse. "You didn't make me that person, Lydia. I did, but you made it easy, and I can't afford easy anymore." Lydia stood on legs that seemed suddenly unstable. Her composure was crumbling in real time, years of careful construction collapsing under the weight of rejection she'd never anticipated. "Everything I did for us, for our future, to build something that mattered. No, you did it for power, for control, for the certainty that no one could ever hurt you because you hurt them first." Ethan's expression held something that looked like genuine regret. "And I understand why. I know your family history. I know what you survived, but understanding doesn't make it acceptable. And I won't keep pretending it does." Tears were streaming down Lydia's face now, and for the first time since Mara had met her, she looked genuinely human rather than carefully performed. "You're going to regret this. When the donations dry up, when the connections disappear, when you realize how much I brought to this foundation, you'll regret it. Maybe, but I'll regret it as someone who finally chose right over easy. I can live with that." He picked up his phone. "Security will escort you out. Your personal items from your office will be packed and sent to your apartment. Effective immediately, your building access is revoked." "Ethan, please." "Goodbye, Lydia." The finality in those 2 words was absolute. Security arrived within minutes. Different guards than before, clearly briefed, professionally compassionate, but utterly firm. Lydia left without further argument, her expensive heels clicking against marble floors in a rhythm that sounded like the ending of something that had seemed permanent. When the door closed behind her, the office felt somehow larger and emptier simultaneously. Patricia broke the silence first. "That was the right decision, but it wasn't easy. Are you all right?" Ethan sank into his chair like someone suddenly exhausted. I should have done it years ago. After the first incident, I excused. After the 10th time, I chose convenience over confrontation. He looked at Mara. I owe you an apology, Miss Quinn. You don't? I do. You've been here a month and you've endured harassment, threats, break-ins, and physical assault because I was too weak to make changes that were obviously necessary. His voice carried genuine regret. You shouldn't have had to be brave because I was too cowardly to be decent. Mara didn't know what to say to that. Part of her wanted to argue, to say he'd done enough by supporting her hiring, by backing her evaluation, by finally ending his engagement. But another part, the honest part, knew he was right. She'd paid costs that should never have been hers to pay because people with more power had chosen comfort over courage for too long. What happens now? She asked instead. Now we figure out what this foundation looks like when integrity isn't optional. Ethan straightened slightly, and something in his expression shifted from regret to determination. Patricia, call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. I want Lydia's remaining term officially terminated. I want new evaluation standards formalized. And I want it made explicitly clear that retaliation against employees who raise concerns will result in immediate dismissal, board member or not. Consider it done. Patricia made notes with efficient satisfaction. Miss Quinn, you're being promoted to Senior Oversight Analyst effective immediately. Your salary increases accordingly, and you'll be taking lead on all major grant evaluations going forward. If you're interested. Mara's brain struggled to process that information. A promotion, after a month, after everything that had happened. Yes, I'm interested. Good. Because we're going to need people who understand that money without accountability isn't philanthropy. It's just public relations. He paused, and his expression softened. And Miss Quinn, thank you for doing what I should have done myself, for being brave when I was being careful, for reminding me that sometimes the most important thing leaders can do is support people who are braver than they are. He stood, extended his hand. Mara shook it, feeling the weight of recognition that felt earned rather than performed. Patricia walked her out, through corridors that felt different now, less threatening, less charged with pending conflict. This isn't over, Patricia warned as they reached Mara's office. Lydia still has connections. The 3 board members she influenced won't flip overnight. And Harrison Whitfield is still telling everyone who listened that we're impossible to work with. But we did the right thing. We did, and sometimes that has to be enough. Patricia smiled. Get some rest, Miss Quinn. Tomorrow we rebuild. Tonight, just survive knowing you changed something important. Mara entered her office and closed the door, sat at her desk, looked out at the city where millions of people were living their own dramas, fighting their own battles, making their own choices about courage versus comfort. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Marcus Chen. Miss Reeves gave me your contact. I heard what happened today. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you. My daughter asked me to tell you that you're her hero. Mine too. Mara read that message 3 times, feeling something crack open in her chest that had been held tight for too long. She'd been so focused on surviving, on holding ground, on not getting crushed by the machinery of power, that she'd lost sight of why any of it mattered. It mattered because a man got to keep his job and his dignity. Because children in underserved communities would eventually get programs that actually worked instead of programs that just looked good in press releases. Because truth had been told in rooms designed to keep it silent. Because someone with wealth and power had finally chosen integrity over comfort, and that choice would ripple outward in ways nobody could fully predict. She typed back, "Tell your daughter that the real heroes are people like you, who show up every day, who work hard, who love their families. I just refuse to look away. But thank you for the message. It means more than you know." Night was falling over Manhattan, painting the city in shades of amber and shadow. Mara packed up her laptop, gathered her things, prepared to leave this building that had become both battleground and sanctuary in the span of a month. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The board meeting would be contentious. Lydia's allies would push back. There would be consequences and complications she couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, Mara Quinn was going home knowing she'd helped break something that needed breaking, knowing she'd helped build something that might actually last, knowing she'd chosen courage when safety would have been so much easier, and knowing that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, choosing right over easy actually worked. She left the building and merged into the evening crowds, becoming anonymous again, just another person heading home after a long day. But she carried with her the weight of understanding that every person in this city was making similar choices, every day, about what they'd tolerate and what they'd challenge. Most people chose tolerance, chose looking away, chose survival over rebellion. And that was okay. That was human. That was the math of life in a world where power wasn't distributed fairly. But some people, not many, but some, chose differently. They looked back when everyone else looked away. They spoke up when everyone else stayed silent. They refused to compromise who they were, even when compromise would save them. Mara had become one of those people. And whatever came next, she'd face it standing up. The emergency board meeting convened at 9 o'clock the following morning, in the same conference room where Mara had presented her evaluation of the Meridian Youth Initiative 3 weeks earlier. But the atmosphere was entirely different now, charged with the kind of tension that comes when institutions are forced to examine themselves honestly and nobody's sure they'll like what they find. Mara sat beside Patricia, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Across the table, the 3 board members who'd been advocating for her dismissal, Margaret Chen, Robert Lawson, and Thomas Bradford, looked like they'd prepared for battle. Senator Whitmore sat with careful neutrality. The fashion designer, Simone Laurent, scrolled through her phone with studied disinterest that suggested she was paying more attention than she appeared. Ethan entered last, carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that made people straighten in their chairs without realizing they'd done it. He sat, surveyed the room, and began without preamble. Thank you all for coming on short notice. You've all received the summary of yesterday's incident involving Lydia Crow and Miss Quinn. We're here to address both that specific situation and larger questions about foundation governance and culture. Margaret Chen, a venture capitalist in her 60s, who'd built her fortune on reading power dynamics and exploiting them, spoke first. With respect, Ethan, I think we need to discuss whether that incident would have occurred at all if Miss Quinn hadn't been hired in the first place. She's been employed here 5 weeks and has already caused 2 major conflicts, alienated a significant donor, and now we have a physical altercation. The pattern is concerning. The pattern I see, Patricia interjected smoothly, is that Miss Quinn has consistently identified and addressed problems that existed long before her arrival. Problems we were all comfortable ignoring because addressing them was inconvenient. Comfortable ignoring? Robert Lawson, a hedge fund manager whose donations funded 3 foundation programs, looked affronted. That's quite an accusation. It's quite accurate. Ethan's voice cut through the building argument. Marcus Chen had been working double shifts for months before Miss Quinn ever walked into that gala. Harrison Whitfield's proposal had glaring deficiencies that any honest evaluation would have caught. Lydia had been treating staff poorly for years. The only thing Miss Quinn did was refuse to pretend none of that was happening. And in the process, she's cost us relationships and donations worth millions, Thomas Bradford pointed out. He was older than the others, a real estate developer who'd known Ethan's father, and he spoke with the authority of someone who'd been around long enough to believe his opinions carried extra weight. Integrity is admirable, but pragmatism keeps foundations operational. Sometimes you need to accept that perfect is the enemy of good. No. The word came from Senator Whitmore, surprising everyone. Perfect isn't the enemy of good. Corruption disguised as pragmatism is the enemy of good. I've been in politics 40 years, Thomas. I know exactly what happens when institutions start making exceptions for people with money and influence. They stop being institutions and become marketplaces where everything's for sale to whoever can pay. He looked directly at Mara, and something in his expression suggested respect earned rather than given. Miss Quinn's evaluation of the Meridian Initiative was thorough and fair. Harrison Whitfield's proposal had problems any competent analyst would have caught, but nobody wanted to catch them because telling Harrison no was uncomfortable. That's not Miss Quinn's failure, that's ours. Margaret leaned forward. Even granting that, we have to address the elephant in the room. Ethan ended his engagement with Lydia directly because of conflicts involving Miss Quinn. That creates an appearance of impropriety that donors and the public will absolutely notice and judge. Then let them judge based on facts, Ethan said quietly. I ended my engagement with Lydia because I finally acknowledged behavior I should have addressed years ago. Miss Quinn didn't cause that decision. She just made it impossible for me to keep avoiding it. He pulled out a folder and distributed copies around the table. This is a timeline of documented incidents involving Lydia Crow and staff over the past 3 years. Complaints that were quietly resolved with settlements and NDAs. Turnover rates in departments she frequently interacted with. Witness statements from yesterday that I obtained from security and other employees. The room went silent as people read. Mara hadn't seen this document before, but watching the board members' expressions change as they absorbed its contents was like watching a structure built on sand finally acknowledge it had no foundation. "My God," Simone murmured. "I knew Lydia could be difficult, but this is what happens when we prioritize appearances over accountability," Ethan said. "When we make exceptions for people who bring resources while ignoring how they treat people without resources. When we convince ourselves that someone's value to the institution outweighs their cost to the people that institution is supposed to serve." He paused, and his voice took on an edge Mara had never heard before. Not anger exactly, but something close to it, tempered by disappointment and determination. "My father taught me that wealth is responsibility, not permission. That having resources means you have an obligation to use them well, not a license to treat people poorly. I've spent 5 years forgetting that lesson because remembering it was uncomfortable. That ends today. Either this foundation stands for something beyond making wealthy people feel philanthropic, or it doesn't deserve to exist." Thomas Bradford set down his copy of the timeline with visible distaste. "You're asking us to potentially sacrifice millions in donations for principles that, frankly, most foundations compromise on every day. I'm asking you to decide what kind of people you want to be." Ethan's response was immediate. "Because every time we make an exception, every time we look away from cruelty because addressing it costs us a donation, every time we approve programs that sound good but won't work because saying no is politically complicated, we're making a choice about who matters and who doesn't. And I'm done making choices that prioritize comfort over conscience." He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "I know some of you have concerns about Miss Quinn, about her experience level, about the conflicts she's been involved in, about whether hiring her was wise. So let me be absolutely clear. Miss Quinn is the best hire this foundation has made in years. Not because she's perfect, but because she's honest. And if we can't build a culture where honesty is valued more than convenience, then we deserve whatever dysfunction we get." Margaret studied Mara with calculating intensity. "Miss Quinn, you've been remarkably silent during this discussion. I'd like to hear your perspective. Did you anticipate the level of conflict your actions would create?" Mara took a breath, organizing thoughts that had been forming over 5 weeks of pressure and crisis. "No, ma'am, I didn't. When I spoke up at the gala, I was thinking about one moment, one person being treated cruelly. I wasn't thinking about organizational politics or donor relationships or career consequences. I was just thinking that somebody needed to say something, and everyone else was choosing not to." She paused, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "And if I'm being completely honest, I'd make the same choice again. Not because I enjoy conflict or want to create problems, but because I fundamentally believe that institutions are only as good as their willingness to live their stated values when it costs them something. The Hale Foundation says it values human dignity and evidence-based programming. Those aren't just marketing slogans, or they shouldn't be. They're commitments that mean something, or they're lies we tell to feel better about wealth we haven't earned." "That's quite idealistic," Robert observed, though his tone was more thoughtful than dismissive. "Maybe. But I've spent most of my life watching what happens when institutions abandon idealism for pragmatism. I've lived in systems designed to process people efficiently rather than help them effectively. I've watched programs that looked impressive in brochures but failed the people they were supposed to serve because nobody wanted to be honest about their limitations." Mara's voice strengthened. "So yes, I'm idealistic, because cynicism dressed up as pragmatism is how good institutions become corrupt ones. And I'd rather risk my career standing for something than build a career standing for nothing." Silence filled the conference room like water pooling in a vessel finally stopped leaking. Then Simone started clapping, slow, deliberate applause that wasn't mockery, but genuine appreciation. I've been on this board 6 years, she said, and that's the most honest thing I've heard in any of these meetings. Margaret, Robert, Thomas. You want to know why we should keep Miss Quinn? Because she just said what all of us think but are too scared to admit. That we've been compromising values we claim to hold because actually holding them is uncomfortable and expensive. Senator Whitmore nodded. I move that we formally terminate Lydia Crow's remaining board term effective immediately, and that we implement the revised evaluation standards Mr. Hale distributed last week. Further, I move that we establish formal protections against retaliation for employees who raise concerns about foundation operations or board member conduct. I second, Simone said immediately. Margaret looked between them, calculation visible in her expression. She was weighing options, measuring costs, deciding which side of history she wanted to land on. I want to be clear about something first. If we do this, if we formalize these protections and standards, we're going to lose donors. People who don't want their pet projects subjected to rigorous evaluation. People who expect board membership to come with certain privileges. People who give generously, but expect gratitude to look like deference. Good, Ethan said flatly. Let them take their money elsewhere. We'll find donors who actually care about impact more than image. You're sure about that? Because this foundation runs on $50 million annually in donations. You cut that by even 20% and programs suffer. Real programs, real people depending on us. Programs built on compromised integrity aren't sustainable anyway, Patricia interjected. They collapse eventually, usually spectacularly. We're choosing controlled reform now over catastrophic failure later. Thomas Bradford had been silent for several minutes, studying the timeline document like it was a contract he was considering signing. Finally, he looked up. I've known your family 30 years, Ethan. I watched your father build this foundation on principles that actually meant something. And I watched it slowly become something he wouldn't recognize. A performance of philanthropy rather than actual commitment to change. He set down the document with finality. Your father would be proud of what you're doing today. Count my vote in favor. Margaret sighed, long and heavy, like someone releasing tension held too long. Fine. I still think this is risky and potentially damaging, but I also think Thomas is right. We've drifted too far from our actual mission. Vote in favor. Robert was the last holdout, and he looked genuinely torn. I need assurances that we're not just burning down the old system without a plan for what replaces it. The plan, Ethan said, is exactly what Miss Quinn has been modeling. Honest evaluation, clear standards, accountability that applies to everyone regardless of how much money they bring. It's not complicated. We've just been pretending it is because actually doing it requires backbone. Robert closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. All right, I'm in. But if this crashes and burns, I reserve the right to say I told you so. Noted. Ethan's smile was brief but genuine. All in favor? 7 hands rose around the table. The motion passed unanimously, and something that had been building for weeks, maybe years, finally resolved itself into forward momentum instead of circular conflict. Patricia produced documentation with the efficiency of someone who'd prepared for exactly this outcome. Board members signed revised protocols. Lydia's termination was formalized. New evaluation standards were adopted. And through it all, Mara sat quietly, trying to process the surreal reality that her refusal to look away at a gala 5 weeks ago had somehow catalyzed institutional reform. When the formalities concluded and board members began gathering their materials, Senator Whitmore approached Mara directly. Miss Quinn, I owe you an apology. When I first heard about your confrontation with Lydia, I assumed you were naive or attention-seeking. I was wrong. What you did took courage most people never develop. Thank you, Senator. Don't thank me, learn from me. His expression was serious. I've spent 40 years in politics making compromises I told myself were necessary, and most of them were. But some weren't. Some were just easier than standing for something difficult. You're young enough to avoid that trap. Don't waste it. He left, followed by others offering congratulations or concerns or careful neutrality. Within 20 minutes, the conference room had emptied except for Ethan, Patricia, and Mara. Well, Patricia said, allowing herself a smile. That went better than I expected. I had contingency plans for 4 different varieties of disaster. Only 4? Ethan's humor was tired but real. You're slipping. He turned to Mara, and his expression shifted to something more serious. Miss Quinn, you should know that the next few months will be complicated. We'll lose donors, we'll face criticism, and you'll probably be blamed for at least some of it, regardless of logic or fairness. I know, but you'll also be building something that might actually last. Programs that work because they're designed honestly rather than marketed dishonestly. Standards that mean something because they're applied consistently. A foundation that serves the people it's supposed to help rather than the people who fund it. He extended his hand again. Thank you for everything. For being brave when I was being careful. For forcing changes I should have made years ago. For reminding me what integrity looks like when it's practiced instead of performed. Mara shook his hand, feeling the weight of recognition that came from someone who'd finally chosen right over easy and understood exactly what that choice cost. Thank you for creating space where honesty didn't cost me everything. A lot of leaders wouldn't have. A lot of leaders are building institutions that won't survive their own compromises. Ethan's smile was sad but determined. I'd rather build something smaller that actually works than something impressive that ultimately fails everyone it touches. Over the following weeks, the foundation reorganized itself around its new standards with the kind of purposeful disruption that comes when institutions finally align actions with stated values. 3 major donors withdrew support, exactly as Margaret had predicted. Harrison Whitfield spent considerable energy telling anyone who'd listen that the Hale Foundation had become impossible to work with. 2 board members who'd been considering joining decided the new direction wasn't for them. But other things happened too. Smaller donors increased contributions, attracted by transparency and honest evaluation. Organizations that had been skeptical of foundation promises started engaging, drawn by evidence of actual accountability. And staff throughout Hale Industries began raising concerns they'd previously kept silent, trusting that speaking up wouldn't automatically cost them their livelihoods. Marcus Chen returned to work in his 3rd week of recovery, and his first action was to request a meeting with Mara. They met in a small conference room where he seemed simultaneously grateful and uncomfortable in a way that suggested he wasn't used to being heard by people with power. I don't know how to thank you properly, he said, hands wrapped around coffee he wasn't drinking. My daughter's treatment is covered, my schedule is manageable, and I don't come to work terrified that one mistake will cost me everything. You don't need to thank me, Marcus. You deserved all of that from the beginning. Maybe, but deserving and receiving are different things, Miss Quinn. Most people go their whole lives deserving better than they get. You made sure I actually received it. His eyes were bright. My daughter wants to meet you. She's 8, and she's decided you're proof that speaking up for what's right actually works. I know you're busy, but if you ever have time... I'd love to meet her, Mara said immediately. Tell me when and where. They met the following Saturday at a small park near Marcus's apartment in Queens. His daughter, Lily, was shy at first, but warmed up quickly, full of questions about what it was like to work in a skyscraper, and whether Mara was scared when she talked to mean people, and if being brave was something you learned or something you just were. I think it's something you practice, Mara told her honestly. Like math or reading. You start with small, brave things, and eventually bigger brave things don't seem as impossible. What was your first brave thing? Lily asked. Mara thought about that question. About foster homes where speaking up meant punishment. About schools where being noticed meant being targeted. About jobs where surviving meant staying invisible. My first brave thing was telling a teacher I was hungry, she said finally. I was 7, and I hadn't eaten in 2 days because my foster placement didn't care much about feeding kids. Admitting I needed help felt like admitting I was weak. But the teacher got me food, and I learned that sometimes asking for help is the bravest thing you can do. Lily absorbed this with 8-year-old seriousness. Then she reached out and hugged Mara with the fierce intensity of someone who understood more than adults gave her credit for. Thank you for being brave for my dad. Mara held that small, brave girl and felt something crack open in her chest that had been armored for too long. This moment of connection with a child who'd almost lost her father to exhaustion and exploitation, this was why integrity mattered, why standards mattered, why someone needed to be willing to speak up even when silence was safer. By the end of her third month at Hale Industries, Mara had settled into rhythms that felt both surreal and sustainable. She evaluated grant proposals with rigorous honesty, conducted site visits that actually examined whether programs worked, and wrote reports that prioritized evidence over politics. Some recommendations made people happy. Others made them furious. But all of them were honest, and that honesty built credibility that couldn't be bought with donations or compromised by pressure. Patricia became not just a supervisor, but a mentor, teaching Mara how to build cases so thorough they became undeniable, how to present uncomfortable truths in ways that minimized defensiveness, how to survive in institutions without becoming institutionalized. The trick, Patricia told her one afternoon, is remembering that you're here to serve the mission, not the organization. Organizations drift. Missions, if you hold them honestly, stay fixed. Ethan transformed too, not dramatically, but steadily, like someone finally remembering who they'd wanted to be before compromise became habit. He started attending site visits personally, talking with program participants instead of just reading reports. He pushed back on donors who expected access to buy influence. And in board meetings, he consistently asked one question that changed every conversation. Is this what our values require, or just what our donors prefer? 6 months after the gala that changed everything, the foundation held its annual donor appreciation event. Mara attended reluctantly, memories of the last gala still sharp enough to make formal events feel dangerous. But this gathering was different, smaller, more intimate, focused on actual program outcomes rather than performative generosity. Near the end of the evening, Ethan addressed the assembled donors with remarks that felt honest rather than scripted. Thank you all for supporting the Foundation's work this year. It hasn't been an easy year. We've implemented new standards that made some people uncomfortable. We've said no to proposals that didn't meet those standards, even when saying yes would have been politically easier. And we've lost relationships and resources because we chose integrity over convenience. He paused, and his expression held something that looked like hard-won peace. But we've also funded 17 programs that are creating measurable, documented change in communities that need it. We've established evaluation processes that actually evaluate rather than just rubber stamp. And we've built a culture where staff can raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Those achievements matter more than any single donation, no matter how large. The applause was genuine but not overwhelming. This crowd understood they were being told that their money didn't buy influence, just the opportunity to contribute to work that would happen with or without their participation. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked relieved. A few looked genuinely inspired. Afterward, Ethan found Mara near the refreshment table. You look like you're planning your escape route. Just remembering the last gala I attended here, it didn't end well. No, it didn't. But it ended honestly, and sometimes that's the only way things can actually end well. He studied her with an expression that suggested he was measuring something, deciding something. Patricia tells me you've been approached by other foundations, bigger institutions, more prestigious positions. Some, yes, but I'm not interested. Why not? Those positions would pay more and come with less baggage than you carry here. Mara thought about how to explain what she'd learned over 6 months of fighting battles she hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. Because here, I'm building something instead of just maintaining something someone else built. Here, my work actually matters instead of just looking impressive. And here, when I tell the truth, people might not like it, but they listen. That's rarer than prestige. Ethan smiled, genuine and tired and grateful. Then I hope you'll stay as long as the work remains meaningful. Because people like you, people who value truth more than comfort, are how institutions stay honest instead of just looking impressive. The gala concluded without incident or drama, and Mara left feeling something she hadn't expected, hope. Not naive optimism that everything would be easy, but genuine belief that institutions could change if enough people insisted they must, that power could be held accountable if enough people refused to look away, that courage was contagious if someone was brave enough to model it first. On Monday morning, she arrived at her office to find a handwritten note on her desk. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, like someone writing through emotion. Miss Quinn, I owe you an apology I don't know how to properly deliver. You were right about me, about my cruelty, about my fear masquerading as control. I've spent 6 months in therapy trying to understand how I became someone who hurt people for entertainment, and I'm still not sure I fully understand. But I understand enough to know that you did me a favor by refusing to let me continue unchallenged. You probably saved Ethan from years more of slow deterioration, and you definitely saved me from becoming even worse than I already was. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your courage, which I tried so hard to punish, ultimately helped me see myself honestly for the first time in decades. I hope you continue being the person you are, even when people like me try to destroy you for it. Lydia Mara read the note 3 times, feeling complicated emotions that didn't resolve into easy categories. Lydia had caused real harm, had threatened and manipulated and tried to ruin her. But she'd also been someone trapped in patterns built from trauma and fear, someone who'd never learned that control wasn't safety and power wasn't protection. She filed the note away, not to forget, but to remember that even people who seemed irredeemable sometimes changed, that accountability didn't have to mean destruction, that justice could include paths to redemption without excusing harm. Years passed with the kind of steady accumulation of small victories that built into significant change. The foundation's reputation shifted from impressive to trustworthy, from performative to authentic. Donations fluctuated but stabilized around donors who actually cared about impact. Programs succeeded at higher rates because they were designed honestly rather than marketed optimistically. And staff throughout the organization learned that raising concerns was valued rather than punished. Mara advanced steadily, senior analyst to program director to vice president of foundation operations. Each promotion came with more responsibility, more complexity, more situations where choosing right over easy required calculation and courage. But she navigated them with principles learned in her first 6 weeks. Tell the truth, document everything, build cases so thorough they become undeniable, and never compromise integrity for convenience. She hired carefully, building a team that shared her values without sharing her exact background. Different people from different paths, united by the belief that institutions served missions, not the other way around. They evaluated honestly, pushed back on power, and changed what philanthropy looked like when it was practiced instead of just performed. Marcus Chen's daughter Lily eventually went to college on a foundation scholarship, studying public policy with the determination of someone who'd learned young that systems could change if people refused to accept dysfunction as inevitable. She interned at the foundation during summers, learning evaluation methodology and institutional accountability from Mara and others who'd built careers on refusing to look away. Ethan Hale remained single, focused on building a foundation his father would recognize and his future self wouldn't regret. He and Mara developed a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. Not friendship exactly, but something equally valuable. The recognition that came from 2 people who'd chosen integrity when compromise would have been easier, and who'd survived consequences that could have destroyed them. On the 10th anniversary of the gala incident, the foundation held a celebration honoring programs that had succeeded specifically because they'd been evaluated honestly rather than approved conveniently. Mara stood in the same ballroom where she'd once been a 4-day employee risking everything, now a vice president who'd helped transform institutional culture through persistent courage and documented truth. Marcus Chen was there with his family. Lily had graduated the previous spring and was working at a nonprofit focused on workers' rights. Other staff members Mara had advocated for over the years attended, people who'd raised concerns about safety violations or discrimination or financial irregularities, who'd been protected rather than punished because culture had shifted toward accountability. Patricia, now retired but still serving as an advisory board member, approached with a smile that suggested satisfaction, hard-earned. "Remember when you were terrified this job would destroy you? I remember thinking I'd be fired within a week. Instead, you rebuilt the institution from inside." Patricia's expression turned thoughtful. "You know what you did that most people never manage? You changed things without becoming like the people you were fighting. You held on to who you were while transforming what the foundation could be. That's rare. I had help. You, Ethan, the team we built, we supported you, but the courage was yours." Patricia squeezed her shoulder. "Don't minimize what you accomplished. You proved that one person refusing to look away can start chain reactions that change entire institutions. That's not small, Mara. That's the whole point. Near the end of the evening, a young woman approached Mara nervously. She was in her early 20s, wearing a uniform that marked her as event staff. Miss Quinn? I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to say something. You're not bothering me. What's your name? Jasmine. I've been working here 3 months, and everyone told me about what you did, about standing up for Marcus, about refusing to stay quiet even when it was dangerous. And I wanted you to know that story changed how I see work, how I see myself. She paused, gathering courage. Last week, I reported a manager who was harassing younger staff. I was scared I'd lose my job, but I remembered what you did, and I thought maybe institutions could be different if enough people refused to accept what's wrong. Mara felt tears threatening, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that courage truly was contagious, that choices made in crisis could ripple outward in ways you'd never fully witness. What happened with your report? The manager was suspended pending investigation. HR thanked me for coming forward, and 3 other people reported similar experiences once they knew it was safe. Jasmine smiled tentatively. So thank you for showing me that speaking up doesn't always end badly. She disappeared back into the event, leaving Mara standing in the ballroom where everything had started, understanding finally what Patricia had been trying to tell her. It wasn't about one dramatic moment of courage. It was about building a culture where courage became normal, where truth-telling became expected, where people like Jasmine felt safe enough to speak up because someone before them had modeled how. The evening concluded with Ethan's remarks, brief and honest, focused on actual achievements rather than performative gratitude. 10 years ago, this foundation began a difficult transformation. We moved from looking impressive to actually mattering, from performing values to practicing them. That transformation started with one person refusing to stay silent when everyone else looked away. It continued with many people choosing integrity over convenience, truth over comfort, accountability over access. He looked directly at Mara. We're not perfect. We still make mistakes. But we've built something that can correct those mistakes because we've built a culture where honesty is valued more than compliance, where courage is rewarded more than conformity. That's the legacy of that night 10 years ago. Not drama, but the foundation it built for systematic change. Applause filled the ballroom, and Mara accepted it with the complicated gratitude of someone who'd paid costs she'd never fully anticipated but had received rewards she couldn't have imagined. She'd thought she was just standing up for one person in one moment. She hadn't understood she was modeling how individuals could transform institutions, how speaking truth could catalyze change, how refusing to look away could build momentum that outlasted any single person's courage. Later, standing on the building's observation deck looking out over Manhattan, Mara reflected on the decade that had passed since she'd been a terrified 4-day employee trying to survive until the weekend. She'd built a career, built a team, built a reputation as someone who evaluated honestly and couldn't be pressured into compromising standards that mattered. But more than that, she'd helped build a culture, one where people like Jasmine felt safe raising concerns, where programs were designed to work rather than just look impressive, where power was held accountable instead of just accommodated, where truth mattered more than convenience and courage was contagious enough to spread through institutional DNA. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lily Chen. Just got accepted to law school, specializing in workers' rights. You inspired this path 10 years ago when you stood up for my dad. Thank you for teaching me that one person's courage can change everything. Mara read that message until it blurred, feeling the weight of understanding that courage wasn't just personal. It was generational, spreading through people whose lives you touched in moments you'd never fully witness. Lily had been 8 years old when her father collapsed. Now she was 28 and choosing law school specifically to protect people like him. That was what courage built. Not just immediate change, but cascading transformation that rippled through years and people and systems until the original moment became foundation rather than anomaly. The city stretched below her in all directions, millions of people making millions of choices about courage and compromise, about speaking up and staying silent, about looking away and looking back. Most would choose safety. Most would choose silence. And that was okay. That was human. That was survival in a world where courage carried costs most people couldn't afford. But some, Not many, but enough, would choose differently. They'd speak up when everyone else stayed silent. They'd refuse to look away when looking was uncomfortable. They'd risk everything for people they barely knew because someone needed to and nobody else would. Mara had become one of those people 10 years ago in a ballroom full of witnesses who expected her to stay invisible and silent. She'd remained one of those people through threats and intimidation and consequences that should have crushed her. And she'd helped create an environment where others could become those people too, where courage was contagious rather than fatal. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole point. The city lights spread before her like stars that had fallen to earth, each one representing a life, a choice, a moment when someone decided whether to look away or look back. Most would look away. Some wouldn't. And those few would change everything, one refusal at a time, one truth at a time, one moment of courage that inspired another until momentum built and institutions transformed and justice became practice instead of just performance. Mara Quinn had started that momentum with 2 words 10 years ago. That's enough. It had been enough. It had been everything. And it had only been the beginning of change that would outlast her, outgrow her, become bigger than any single person's courage, because it had been planted honestly and tended carefully by people who believed truth mattered more than comfort. She left the observation deck and headed home, carrying with her the knowledge that somewhere in this vast city, someone was facing their own moment of choice, their own calculation of courage versus safety, their own decision about whether to speak up or stay silent. And maybe, just maybe, they'd remember a story about a woman who'd chosen courage when everyone else chose comfort, who'd survived consequences that should have destroyed her, who'd built something that mattered instead of something that just looked impressive. Maybe that story would give them strength to make the harder choice. Maybe courage would remain contagious for another 10 years, another generation, another cascade of changes that started with one person refusing to look away. Maybe that was how justice worked, not through dramatic moments of revolution, but through quiet accumulations of courage that transformed institutions from inside until they finally matched the values they claimed. Mara hoped so. She believed so. And tomorrow she'd return to work and continue the daily practice of choosing right over easy, truth over comfort, courage over compromise. Because someone needed to. Because it mattered. Because truth, told consistently enough, eventually became culture. And culture, built honestly enough, eventually became change that lasted.